Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 9th and final meeting of the Task Force on Optimal PSAP Architecture. I know you're all saddened by that. A few housekeeping things before I introduce David Simpson. We are, of course, have the event on our FCC web events page. We do have closed captioning today. And so I would ask you to speak as clearly as you possibly can, particularly when delivering particularly cumbersome terms and phrases that of a technical nature. And also, when you do speak, especially during the discussion phase, if you could please identify yourselves prior to talking, that would greatly assist them, as well as make it very clear to those who are following along as to who is speaking. All of the PowerPoints that will be discussed today should be available at present on the website. And of course, assuming we have votes of approval for today's documents, those will be posted as soon as possible. We'll want to make sure all the margins are correct and all that. So those should land at the task force website early next week, I would estimate. So with that, I would like to introduce to you David Simpson, Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for your yeoman's effort for 2 years in being the designated federal official for this Federal Advisory Committee. That's not an easy job, and you have handled it with great aplomb, but great effectiveness as well in helping the group give their best effort towards a really remarkable product. So we on behalf of them all, let me thank you. Yeah. This is the final meeting of the Task Force on Optimal PSAP, I should say it all, on Optimal Public Safety Answering Point Architecture, TFOPA. That's a mouthful. It's the ugliest acronym ever, but you guys have made the ugliest acronym ever one of the most enjoyable and probably productive time that I've had a chance to be a part of any collective group's work over the last couple of years. And I truly appreciate the commitment from each of you towards this task. It was not as much a labor of love, but a labor of passion towards all wanting to do good for people, do good for communities, to help ensure that on individuals' worst days, they have the maximum ability to call for help and get appropriately dispatched help to minimize their suffering. So thank you so much for that. This will strengthen PSAPs deeply. It will help emergency response stakeholders, and when I say stakeholders, the decision makers as well. It'll help their knowledge and readiness to undertake the critical nationwide deployment of next generation 911 systems. I'd like to take a moment to applaud the early adopters across the country. We've got a number of jurisdictions that just have done some amazing things out in the, I think it's I'm going to screw it up, it's either the 82nd Airborne or the 101st, which his motto is ahead of them all. It's hard to cut trail in a new technology, in particular when your use of that technology has to be perfect. You are a risk-averse organization to begin with, and so many jurisdictions in states have steered into those uncertain waters to map the navigation charts. Got to get some naval acronyms in there, for implementing internet-based emergency communications for their citizens. Their experience in learning has been captured in the recommendations of this task force and has served to underpin the consolidated report you adopted at the beginning of this year. The consolidated report set forth the necessary foundations for next-generation 911 implementation in the areas of cybersecurity, network architecture implementation, and optimal resource allocation in a time of scarce resources. by itself a solid body of recommendations and guidance that every local, state, and federal 911 decision maker should be familiar with. We sent a copy of the report to every governor in the state, and many state governors or their staff have subsequently contacted us and contacted many of you to help understand how the report could inform their decisions over this last year. And that was just the halfway product. Today, you provide an additional set of navigation charts providing deeper guidance and recommendations. Working Group 1, led by formerly APCO's DHS, still representing APCO, J English, delivers you a detailed analysis of the Emergency Communications Cybersecurity Center, EC3, without a firm appreciation that all PSAPs, whether legacy or next-gen 911 ready, whether local, regional, or state administered, must be cybersecure facilities capable of defending themselves against modern cyber threats. But if 6,500 PSAPs all on their own take on all the responsibility of becoming end-to-end cyber secure, that's probably an unaffordable, unattainable task for the nation. So the work that you did and your group did to pull together an operational construct that will allow PSAPs to not only be effective but efficient in achieving cyber secure readiness, I think is remarkable, will be very helpful as states and localities implement next generation 911, and it will set the groundwork for the cooperative engagement between jurisdictions to ensure that they can achieve that efficiency and effectiveness. Working Group 2, under the steady hand of David Hall from the Keystone State. It's good if you need steady, go to the Keystone State, right? Recently Deputy Director with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency and now Director of Safety for Lower Allen Township, provides a next-gen 911 readiness scorecard and self-assessment matrix, which public safety entities can use to assess their level of next-gen 911 readiness. In addition, the working group to essential workforce and education planning recommendations, as well as case study analysis of real-world ESI nets, the foundation IP networks over which next-gen 911 calls will ride. This scorecard is so important because as jurisdictions really appreciate the task of, oh my gosh, this is going to cost money, and I don't have the ability to fund it all at once. So where am I in that march to get to ultimate all the next generation 911 capabilities that we want to have, and how can I communicate about that in a way that makes sense to the jurisdictional political leaders that need to rationalize budget, to citizens that need to accept what we're doing with 911 fees, and in a way where you can clearly articulate the capabilities, operational capabilities attained in a given public safety answering point. Invaluable work, and looking forward to here. I got a little bit of a preview of how that is nicely harmonized with the work that Lori Flaherty and NHTSA is doing to inform a lot of our next steps. I don't want to take thunder away, but really excited to hear that today. Working Group 3, overseen by Jim Gerke. Jim, were you Jim is on the line? But I'm sure you're wearing a big belt buckle and have a big hat on because you certainly have stood up to that big cowboy challenge of providing a funding sustainment model, uncovering the cost components and developing a funding statement model that can be used by state and 911 authorities to calculate their financial needs to support a transitional next-gen 911 implementation. So important that we have the ability not only to define the technical architecture for what a PSAP should be, the efficient and effective way to do cybersecurity, but also how that maps into the collection of revenues that will pay for the implementation and the sustainment of these capabilities in an evolving technology landscape. Jim, we applaud you and are looking forward to hearing the results of your working group's task. Next year, 2017, promises to be a critical year for Next Generation 911. First, in addition to the early adopters, a number of additional states and local jurisdictions will begin in earnest to build upon the successes of the early adopters and PSAPs and launch their Next Gen 911 systems. But as Chairman Wheeler has testified before Congress on numerous occasions, the relatively plodding nature of Next Gen 911 development does a disservice to the public safety community. It puts us in this extended transition period for years, decade or more, where there is unnecessary uncertainty in what capabilities are going to be there when, uncertainty in consumers and citizens as they travel from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and not know exactly what to expect from Next Gen 911. But it also requires these PSAPs to continue to rely on legacy end-of-life technology and 911 systems at the same time that commercial and consumer services wholly adopt IP-based platforms. It threatens the overall integrity and effectiveness of the nation's emergency response capabilities. This is really something I want to underscore because the focus of the telecommunications service providers will be on improving the reliability, the availability of their current products. That's where the big investment's going to be. The retaining of an interdependence on legacy infrastructure only used for this one purpose is a recipe for disaster. And we need folks to wake up about the transition, that it won't get better with the legacy availability. It will get worse. And the good news is that technological solutions are there. The roadmap on how to do it is there. The checklist for how to match that to the resource collection is there. So we very much want this report to communicate to decision makers, not just at the local jurisdiction level and the state level, but also at the federal level, and help them understand how the federal government can help facilitate shrinking that transition window, which is all too long. Second, our federal partners at the National 911 Program Office, which I alluded to Lori before, have initiated a comprehensive cost study to assess the expected costs of Next Gen 911 deployment and operations, with completion slated for later next year. In addition, the National 911 Program Office has commenced its rulemaking proceeding to define the grant program for administering $115 million in auction proceeds for 911 and Next Gen 911 implementation. That's money already authorized for that purpose. The work of this task force should inform the outcome of those important projects. In closing, I would remind you that when we first gathered almost 2 years ago, we remarked upon the total years of public safety experience among the members that would be brought to bear on this project, and it exceeded the centuries, 700 years plus total. At the top of the list, though, the top of the top, is none other than our chair, Steve Souter, whose special achievement we must recognize today, and we will more formally at the end of this proceeding. But let me take just a moment here to say that under Steve's leadership, this task force has been a trailblazer for the 911 community, providing a vital roadmap to local, state, and federal 911 authorities and government decision makers on how to successfully navigate the transition to next generation 911. I'm so impressed with Steve because, you go to his PSAP and you say, wow, that's how it should be done. Wouldn't be nice if we had those resources. But that didn't happen by accident. I know that one of the reasons why Fairfax County's PSAP is a model, like some of the other model PSAPs out there, is because Steve was effectively able to communicate the value proposition of upgrading the county's 911 capabilities to political decision makers that have every day a very tough job in determining where to put the community's next nickel. And your ability to clearly articulate that, we tapped into, and we've all benefited from. And we very much appreciate your leadership of this task force that at the beginning of the year has already had nationwide impact and will continue to be a next-gen 911 transition Rosetta Stone. It would take an additional public meeting to adequately cover all of your accomplishments since you started your public career in the 60s with the District of Columbia Fire Department, first as a firefighter, then a radio dispatcher. Steve's first day as a DC dispatcher was the day the district erupted in the wake of the Dr. Martin Luther King assassination, and he's been on call for every major emergency that region has faced since. From the 1982 Air Florida crash, just a small side note, I was in D.C. that day. I was
really
at a Rickover interview downtown on that snowy day when there was ice in the river, going over the 14th Street Bridge. 11th Street Bridge. I got my 14th Street Bridge, yeah. And Steve was the guy in the chair on watch. To the September 11th attack on the Pentagon, to the 2012 derecho storm, which we all know well here. Steve moved on from D.C. to serve as the 911 director in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Arlington, Virginia, before becoming the director of the Fairfax County, Virginia Department of Public Safety in 2005. It's no accident that the National Capital Region has PSAP pearls. Steve has touched so many of those pearls in so many ways. Steve not only provided 24/7 by 365 911 service to the citizens of Fairfax County, he's been a tireless advocate for continued improvements in the 911 system. On top of Steve's day job, he's contributed countless hours to the national public safety organizations such as APCO and NENA, serving on the National Capital Region Council of Governments and testifying before so many government panels. He's also welcomed numerous public officials, members of the press, and other visitors to visit Fairfax County's state-of-the-art center and get a ground-level view of 911. And I'm proud to be one of the many people that has learned from a Steve Satter-led tour. I'm also proud and very thankful to be a constituent in Steve Satter's jurisdiction where I sleep well at night knowing that Steve's team's on watch. Recognizing Steve's experience and expertise on public safety matters, we at the Commission have called upon him repeatedly to provide leadership and insight, and he graciously answered the call every time. He has served on our Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, the CISRIC, and has now successfully led the task force on optimal PSAP architecture, helping to lay the groundwork for the national transition to next-gen 911. Throughout Steve's career, he's been a tireless advocate on behalf of the nation's 911 call takers and dispatchers who are truly the first of the first responders when the public calls for help. He has spoken eloquently about the vital service these women and men provide and the tremendous stress and sacrifice that their work entails. In an interview a few years ago, Steve remarked, "If you love what you do, you never have to work a day in your life." And I can tell you that Steve has loved what he's done throughout his life. Steve, given your obvious love for what you do and the contributions you've made, you're in fact one of the hardest working people in the public safety communications profession. Your enthusiasm for what you do is infectious. We are all infected. Thank you. Your professionalism, patience, kindness, and dedication in the best spirit of public service has helped make the American public safety communication system the envy of the world. We will miss you, but we are inspired by your example to carry on in that spirit. And on that note, Steve, it's your meeting.
Okay. Admiral, thank you for those very exaggerated words. Tim mentioned that this is our 9th meeting. And I don't really look at it as the number of meetings that we've had, but I look at it more as the adventure and the trip that we've taken together. I'm not sure really whose initiative it was that the task force be formed, but I certainly want to give credit to the Commission in general, to the chairman in particular, to David and David Firth and Tim, and there were probably others.
And I might add, Commissioner O'Reilly was a particular impetus.
That is correct, and I recall that, and thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly in particular. Somebody else in the commission had the good wisdom to put together a team of people that are largely at this table today. There are a few that are no longer on the task force. There are some that can't make this meeting but are on the bridge. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to take a moment or two and echo some of your remarks about the task force in general. We came together representing every facet of the 911 profession and industry and beyond. Many of us knew each other and some of us didn't. We certainly had varied points of view and constituency that we were representing. But I cannot imagine anything in my entire career, which spans 49 years in 911, but for a few months, and 62 years in public safety, where a more passionate, respectful, knowledgeable, dedicated group of people came together, took the charge that we were given, met, discussed, I won't say argue, but certainly represented our various positions.
Polished product.
Came to consensus, and today we will hopefully approve the final work product of the three work groups. I'd like to thank particularly Jay and David and Jim. If you're on the phone, I hope you are. And if Phil Jones by chance might be listening in, I owe a debt of gratitude to Phil also. He was there for the first year. I'd like to think that we have done some incredible work. In the short time since I was last at this microphone, I, like many of you, have had the opportunity to be out and about, most recently earlier this week in Los Angeles 911. Our work product to date and what we have been attempting to do was often spoken about at that meeting, and that's but one meeting of many that I have been at, and to come away with that same feeling, which is very gratifying to know that even without the final product being out there, the work of this body of people are already recognized and I think are being utilized for the good of the whole. We've had a little help along the way. A gentleman by the name of John Oliver gave us a little bit of a kickstart. That was good. Thank you, John, if you're listening. But also, I want to mention something else that I believe I may have mentioned once before. On 9/11, we all know where we were. I was in the Arlington County 911 Center, and at that particularly fateful moment in time, I was putting on a necktie to go to a press conference that was being held by NENA on the grounds of the Capitol, particularly the southeast grounds of the Capitol, where NENA was intending to announce and present to the Congress the 911 report card to the nation. That press conference didn't occur. The report did get presented a couple weeks or months later. I guess it was around Thanksgiving, if I'm correct. But I want to draw attention to 2 of the 8 names that were on that body that put together that report card. It was well represented, as this task force is, by movers and shakers and recognized and esteemed members of the 911 community back then. But of particular interest is that 2 of the members are either in this room or on this call today. And that is Tom Wheeler, current chair of the commission, and at that point in time, the executive director of CTIA, and also our own Jim Gerke, who is on the phone out of Austin, Texas. There were others, but I want to take this opportunity to recognize both of them because I believe that document, although it was never intended and nothing in it referred to Next Generation 911, I believe that document was the foundational document that really gave rise to where we are today and will continue to be the foundational document, combined with our document and other efforts that are out there to really move next generation forward and achieve the goal in 2020. So, Chairman, if you're listening, I hope you are. I sincerely want to thank you for your early efforts and your continued efforts. And Jim, again, my friend, thank you for stepping up anytime anybody has ever asked you to step up and do a very, very credible body of work. So with that, we have business to take care of. Let's begin over here with Brian, and we'll go around the table and introduce ourselves, and then we'll go to the folks that are on the bridge. Brian?
Brian Fonts with NENA, National Emergency Member Association.
Good afternoon, Lori Flaherty with the National 911 Program at the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Good afternoon, Mark Fletcher, Chief Architect, Public Safety Services at Avaya.
John Brittingham, Verizon.
Dan Sawicki, Motorola Solutions.
Dave Hall, the Chair of Work Group 2.
Mary Boyd, West Safety.
Tony Montani, Director of E911 Operations and Engineering for Verizon.
April Heinze within Digital.
Lisa Hall with the Michigan Communications Directors Association.
Joe Heaps, National Institute of Justice within the U.S. Department of Justice.
Jay English, Working Group 1 Chair.
Robert Brown, NIPSTIC.
Daryl Branson, representing National Association of State 911 Administrators.
Tim Schramm, Nebraska Public Service Commission, one of the representatives of NARUC, National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners.
Good afternoon. Dusty Rhodes, Department of Homeland Security, Office of Emergency Communications.
Alicia Burns with the Digital Decision.
Christy Williams with North Central Texas Council of Governments.
Good afternoon. Ron Bloom, Frontier Communications.
David Firth, Deputy Chief of the Public Safety Bureau.
Thank you, David. And to the bridge, anyone?
Alfredo Bocanire.
Could you repeat that one more time, please? Thank you.
Sure, it's Alfredo Bocanire.
Thank you, sir. Next.
Hey, Steve, Jim Gerke.
Hello, Jim. Next.
Gina Green, Bernard Boba, Skype.
Repeat. There were two people at once. I'm sorry.
Gina Green with Sprint.
Gina, hello. Next.
Hi. Bernard Boba, Microsoft.
Yes, sir. Anyone else?
Good afternoon, Steve. It's Jeff Whittick from Airbus DS Communications.
Good afternoon, Jeff. Next.
Larry Hatch, Oregon APCO NENA.
Thank you, sir. Next. Very good.
Just note that Chris Littlewood is also he's Center for Public Safety Innovations.
And Chris.
Good afternoon. This is Chris Littlewood. I'm on the phone bridge from St. Petersburg College Center for Public Safety Innovation.
Thank you, Chris. Tim just drew my attention to that. The agenda, as you'll note, is typical of our agendas. We don't necessarily begin with 1, 2, and 3 of the work groups, but we skip it around a little bit. We're going to begin with work group number 3 today, Jim Gerke out of Austin. We all know the ground rules. If you have comments or questions, please put your tent upright so it'll draw attention to that. And we will also give ample opportunity for those on the bridge that may have any comments they want to offer. Jim, good afternoon again, and we know you're not quite yourself and a little under the weather, but we appreciate you taking the time to come back to us and to make the final report of work group number 3. Jim?
Thank you, Steve. Up until 2 or 3 days ago, I was fully planning on being there, and I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there in person today. I want to add my thanks to you, like Admiral Simpson did. Appreciate your leadership and in a bit of an envious way, offer you my best wishes as you move on to retirement, though I have a really hard time believing that's what you're going to do. I also want to second your thanks to Admiral Simpson and to Tim May, John Adams, and all of the Commission staff for the opportunity to participate in this task force over the last couple of years. I think I speak on behalf of all the members on Work Group 3. It's been a interesting process, By nature, it's a consensus-driven process, and while at times when our deliberations became heartfelt, we were always able to agree on a final document or what we would say or what we would publish, and so I appreciate that. If we could go on to the next slide. Next slide, please. Also want to thank all the members on my work group. Collectively, they all worked hard over the last year or so, or 9 months or so. I want to particularly extend my appreciation to Mary Boyd and to Don Brittingham, who led the two subgroups that we organized, and I talked about that at our last face-to-face meeting. The substance of our report came from their efforts, and that is truly appreciated. Also want to thank the task force members that provided comments on our report. We had some 5 members that did that. The comments were all substantive and to the point, and they helped make the report a better report. So I appreciate that. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So just kind of a reminder of what we started with. Our task was to develop a funding sustainment model that can be used by state 911 authorities to calculate their financial needs as they transition the next generation 911. In the process of doing that, we wanted to provide something to 911 authorities and those state and local decision makers that they could use to identify potential revenue and contribution sources and factor in other potential sources for funding 911 systems. And also, in the process of doing that, to the extent possible, include a breakdown of common costs for PSAPs. The point there being that if we're going to identify how we're going to fund 911, then we need to know something about the nature of the costs that we'll be funding. Next slide, please. So our final report that's on the table today includes 6 sections. It includes an introduction, a table identifying all the work group members that participated in our process, an executive summary, and then the 3, I would say, the main sections of the report, the substantive sections of the report that include a section on common costs in 911 systems, and followed up by funding mechanisms and revenue sources, and then finally ending with the development of funding sustainment model. Next slide, please. We also included some, and I'll just take a second to talk about these, some 6 appendices that we feel like provide some additional detail or foundation for the content that's in the body of the report. The first appendix, Appendix A, shares procurement experience from 3 states that have engaged in that, procuring next-generation 911 systems and services. Those 3 states including New Hampshire, Texas, and Massachusetts. The second appendix delves in a little bit greater detail into the nature of PSAP and 911 authority equipment. Appendix C provides the most recent data that we could find, primarily from NENA and from NASNA, on 911 service fees by states. The next appendix provides a listing of federal financial assistance programs that may or potentially could be used to support aspects of next generation 911 migration. I want to thank Lori and our folks on the Emergency Communications Preparedness Center for helping us out on that data. Appendix E provides a series of references for readers of the report about the nature of the commercial communication service market and where you can get data on what's happening in that arena. And And then finally, the last appendix, the 911 Grant Program appendix, again, thanks to Lori, summarizes how funds from the E911 Grant Program are utilized by states in kind of their initial time frame of 2009 through 2012. Next slide, please. So that moves us into the, I think, the substantive part of the report. It starts out with the structure that deals essentially with common costs of 911 systems and services. We introduced that section with a subsection that is designed to kind of orient the reader to the nature of 911 costs and cost recovery in the world of 911. It builds on the nature of non-recurring and recurring costs. And then we immediately move into the components and elements of 911 costs themselves. Like a couple of our fellow work groups, we elected early on to take advantage of and to follow the maturity model approach that the National 911 Program Office is following in their particular cost study. And I think, as most task force members are aware, they have, organized those around a structure that groups potential costs into a series of domains. And we did the same thing. So we have, our sections that we use in a couple places. We consolidated domains. We had a business domain, a data domain, a section dealing with application systems and infrastructure domains, a security domain, and an operational performance domain. So the business domain addresses things like the cost of governance, planning, policy, procurement, and so on. Data covers things like MSEG, alley costs, additional data, etc. The application systems and infrastructure domain covers physical facilities and related costs, network and call routing, IP infrastructure, PSAP 911 authority equipment. Security domain is security, and then the operational performance PSAP 911 authority operational domain covers operational and staffing expenses, training, backup facilities, and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. That then moves us into the funding sustainment section of the report. There are two pieces to that. There's the first section addresses funding mechanisms and potential revenue sources, and then the major section actually addresses the development of funding sustainment model. Under the first section, we introduced that with kind of our approach and the foundation of the analysis that we went through as we looked at funding mechanisms. That built, for example, upon the guiding policy principles that were identified in the First TFOPA report from last year. We felt like those were excellent principles and needed to continue to help us guide through our analysis. That then moves into a review of the current 911 funding system. That's broken out into a description of the current funding mechanisms used today around the country. It then talks about the challenges to those funding mechanisms that are provided by evolving communications technology and how the communications service environment is changing. That kind of then naturally moves into the current and future market trends and the impact that those are having or potentially could have on 911 funding. Then under the section dealing with potential new funding or revenue mechanisms, we really looked at three revenue In that particular section, we argue in favor of increased federal funding for Next Generation 911 to support things like national security and preparedness, interstate coordination, networks and services, capital costs, sharing a network, Next Generation 911 network components, and so on. It also references, as I did earlier, the Emergency Communications Preparedness Center and the value of their coordination, and provides a series of guidelines for federal grants drawn upon a variety of those resources that are currently out there. Thanks again to Lori and Joe Heaps, Dusty, Jerry, and our other federal partners on the task force for helping us through that. I think that's a great section. And then we had a section, obviously, on network connection fee, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then finally we end with the funding sustainment model itself. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Under the section dealing with network connection fee, we acknowledge that the first TFOPA report and the content in that report that delves into a network connection fee and the nature of the network connection fee that was described there. We do not take a position on the legality of any such fees. We felt like that was outside of the scope of our purview, nor did we really have the legal resources to do that. So we offer a series of approaches or options for a network connection fee, and I guess the caveat there is as they are legal. We do examine those options and the impact that such options might have on both consumers and the state of competition in the service market. Point out that we limit our discussion to wireline services based in part upon the recommendation of the First TFOPA report that suggested or commented that wireless under a network connection fee would continue to have a single surcharge per account user device as it currently does around the country. And also, we really didn't have the opportunity or the information or data to delve into broadband services for businesses. I think as that data is developed, I think that that's part of this discussion that probably needs to be revisited. And I know that NASDA and Darrell, I know that currently NASDA is attempting to collect some of this information and data, and that would be helpful. Next slide, please. So we looked at 4 different types of network connection fees. The single flat rate 911 charge, this would be an option that would apply a single flat rate 911 fee on any underlying network connection that would support any means of access to 911. The mode-dependent fee would apply a separate 911 fee for each mode of 911 access supported. So, for example, if you have a network connection that supports both voice and video access to 911, then that connection would be assessed through fees. The capacity-based 911 charge, was first brought up in the First TFOPA report. I mean, this would apply, potentially would apply, or theoretically would apply a separate 911 fee for each voice equivalent channel that could be used, that could be supported on an underlying network connection. And then finally, we looked at a revenue-based 911 charge, which would apply a 911 fee based on the total revenue derived by an underlying network provider. For example, let's say 2% of a monthly price of such a service. Obviously, we had to make some assumptions, as we attempted to compare all of these approaches in a consistent and fair way. There are a series of assumptions that we've identified in the report. We apply, as I indicated earlier, the funding principles. So one of our reviewing criteria was to apply the funding principles from the First TFOPA report. And then finally, we don't attempt to recommend a specific option, but rather we identify the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. And I can give you an example. For example, it was difficult for us to avoid pointing out that on the last two approaches, the capacity-based 9/1 charge and the revenue-based 9/1 charge, that potentially you're running the risk of unfairly shifting a funding responsibility to broadband consumers, and that, we pointed out that would be inconsistent with both our policy principles and potentially would create issues of competition for the service provider community. Next slide, please.
Hey, Jim, a quick question.
Yes.
The flip side of that is true also, though, right? That to not address broadband at all could disproportionately burden legacy services. More and more consumers are using broadband for their communication needs.
Next slide, please.
Jim, a quick question.
Yes.
The flip side of that is true also, though, right?
Jim.
Not address broadband at
Jim.
all could disproportionately burden legacy services.
If I could ask everybody on the bridge to mute their phones, there appears to be a significant delay, and somebody's delayed is coming back over the bridge. And David Simpson had a question for Jim Gerke. Let's hold that question and see if Jim can come back on in real time.
If I could ask everybody on the bridge to mute their phones, there appears to be a significant delay, and somebody's delayed is coming back over the bridge, and David Simpson had a question for Jim Gerke. Let's hold that question and see if Jim can come back on in real time.
All right. I understand that we're going to hold that question till the end, and I'm almost there. The next slide is essentially our last slide. So this is the final part of the report that actually pulls together content or material from the first section of the report, logically, that deals with common costs, and then applies potential funding mechanisms to that in a simple, straightforward way. So, taking into account the various sources of revenue that we identified, along with all the common costs that we had identified. But before we get to questions, that's essentially, our report. I would invite, particularly since I'm 5 seconds behind everyone, I'd invite either Don or Mary to offer any follow-up comments that they want to at this point.
Well, this is Don. This is Don Brittingham. I don't have any comments, but I'm happy to answer questions to you, especially Admiral, if you have any about what we did.
Don, just the one question about, I want to make sure that I understood Jim's point with regard to, we certainly wouldn't want to disproportionately burden broadband consumers and have them take on a resourcing responsibility disproportionately and not have the legacy services carry the weight by having a improperly constructed broadband fee. But by the same token, we wouldn't want to, I think, disproportionately burden a shrinking pool of legacy service customers on the total PSAP costs, for which they would be paying more and more of what that pool is using less and less of.
Yeah, and let me address that just by way of an example, because as is laid out in the report, the capacity-based fee, for example, and based on the assumptions, and that obviously the type of broadband services that a consumer might have, could result in a fee that's equal to hundreds of times what, let's say, a local exchange customer may incur, and clearly that was one of the reasons why we believed it was not equitable.
Yeah. So just because they chose in their home to be a high speed, I'm watching all my Netflix and gaming, but they still only have one individual who might call 911.
Exactly. So their ability to access 911 may not be appreciably different than someone that just has local exchange service. Obviously, it may enable them to do that in different modes that the other consumer cannot, but to pay hundreds of times more in fee wouldn't seem equitable. On the other hand, even of all the options, I mean, even the single surcharge, the flat rate option, would apply it to a broadband service, so that, for example, even if you don't subscribe, a consumer doesn't subscribe to a local exchange line, if they have broadband and they have the ability to access 911 in some means, then they would incur a fee essentially equivalent to what they would have incurred if they were buying a traditional service. Whereas in many cases, that may not be the case today. So I think the view was that, certainly from a consumer perspective, both the single charge and the mode-dependent options certainly seem to be more equitable, because they were more equivalent in terms of the fee that would actually be incurred by a consumer for 911 access as compared to traditional mechanisms, whereas in the case of either the capacity-based or the revenue-based, it would be a substantial multiplier in terms of that fee. So
that's very helpful. So the decision element here is not around whether to disproportionately have one mode or another mode take on the resource cost, but to accomplish the transition of what consumers are using in the way of modes, and through the choice of the plans, determine which of those most equitably distributes the responsibility for arriving at the objective new technology state.
Right.
Okay.
Hey, Jim, it's Mary. I just want to point out and thank the indulgence of the work group. We had to make some very minor amendments to Appendix B just so the task force knows. We sent those out to him. There you are, reflected in the current copy. Just so in all transparency, we fixed some terminology as well in reference to communications personnel, cleaned that up, and also a reference to the Freedom of Information Act. Joe Binkert, rightfully so, if Joe you're listening, thank you, corrected that really should have referenced the Open Records Acts based on the variances in states. So I just wanted to clarify that, and I too want to thank everyone for a tremendous job on identifying all the cost components within the PSAP, within the Next Gen 911 environment. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Don and Mary. Are there any other questions on the bridge or comments? Jim, before we move on, there was a question raised by Admiral Simpson just about at the time there was a little bit of feedback coming across the the microphone. I'm going to ask Admiral Simpson to kind of restate his question or comment so that you can hear it clearly and respond as appropriate.
Jim, I think Don gave me the answer that I was seeking, that in all cases there is a transition of responsibility into the new objective technologies, and that the plans were laid out in a way that would help illustrate the most equitable ways of achieving that end. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or did I miss the mark completely?
So just to understand, so Jim has an audio out on the conference bridge is not great for him. He's actually getting better audio via the webcast. The webcast could be delayed up to 30 seconds. So he may hear your question. It's just he needs a little bit of time to let it run through. So that's
the last time I asked Jim anything.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or did I miss the mark completely?
I have a question.
Yes, and who is it, please?
It's Alfredo Bocanegra.
Yes, sir.
911 Rescue. The topic came up earlier in the study that would focus on emerging technologies or innovative technologies and the costs associated with introducing those technologies into an existing industry, such as the 911 industry, as well as introducing such a technology during a transitional period. Was there any study done that would take that into consideration?
Thank you for the question. Jim, did you hear that?
I'm sorry, Steve. I'm having a hard time hearing. Could the question be repeated, or if Don or Mary can respond to it, that'd be fine.
I'm going to take advantage of your suggestion there and turn to Don or Mary to do that in the spirit of time and efficiency. Thank you.
So, Alfredo, it's Mary Boyd. As we identified the various components in the report of the cost, whether it's legacy or all through the various maturity models, we looked at enhanced data elements. We basically prompt the stakeholders that will read this document to not only be knowledgeable of what they have in place today in legacy technologies, but as they advance, whether it's GIS, whether it's advanced data. And I think that probably addresses your question in terms of, did we acknowledge that? Yes. Did we actually get into detail to do actual cost analysis of those technologies? No. That was beyond the scope and the time frame in which we had, but we did identify for the 911 stakeholders in the report to watch for those as they advance in the maturity models.
Mary, related to that.
Thank you. I guess just a question would be, is it going to be a topic for the future? That might be a topic of interest, potentially.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Mary, related to that, there will be, in any transition like this that a PSAP would undergo, a period of time when you're conducting parallel operations.
Correct.
Does the cost breakdown template show how to capture both of those and the cost of having to extend parallel operations for a given time, so that decision makers can see the value in investing enough to not have sustained parallel operations?
Yes, sir. We recognize both in Work Group 3, and I think you're going to hear in Work Group 2's report in a minute, where we cover that in both of the reports, that as you migrate and you transition and you're running parallel systems, to make sure and inventory those elements and understand what it stays in place from legacy to foundational to your intermediate models, and we'll demonstrate to you in just a minute where the checklist is so they can begin to see those elements.
Thanks.
Not have
spoke at Work Group 3, and I think you're in Work Group 2 report in a minute.
Jim, we're about to call for final comments and a vote on adoption of this work group's effort, recognizing that you do have some audio issues there. Is there anything you'd like to offer?
Steve, is that to me?
It was. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. No, I don't have anything further to offer. I'm sorry for our technical challenges here. I appreciate Don's and Mary's chiming in to help address that. But I don't have anything further unless there are additional questions.
Okay. Are there any other additional questions on the bridge or in the room? Having heard none, then what I would like to suggest is that some person move for the task force to adopt the work group 3 effort, and just for a process, we will be asking for adoption of the 3 work groups independently, and then, assuming we get adoption, we will finalize by adopting the entire collective effort of all 3 task forces. Lori Flaherty, seconded by David Hall. Any comments? All in favor of adoption of this excellent work group effort from number 3, signify by saying aye in the room.
Aye.
And aye on the phone.
Aye.
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 Consider
Thank
it
you,
adopted.
Steve.
And again, to Jim and to all of your outstanding work group members, thank you so much. Not only is it comprehensive, but it's very understandable. And we knew going into it that in all of these independent efforts, we wanted to be sure that the end result and the end reader would be able to read it and have a pretty good understanding. And certainly you've done an outstanding job at doing that, and we look forward to the same from Dave and from Jay as well. Very good. We're going to move on now to work group number 1. Jay English, Gerald English, as we've come to know him of late with his new position. Gerald, how are you, sir?
Couldn't resist, could you? As I've said several times, DHS is very flexible in how they set up your email. You will do it their way. So my first name is Gerald, and that's why it's the email that you get. Thank you, sir. I'm going to save my thank yous for the end because I have a couple of things that I'd like to end with, and I'll just get right into the presentation, if I can work the remote. Phase 2 tasking for Working Group 1 was an in-depth review of the EC3, the Emergency Communications Cybersecurity Center. The recommendations adopted in the first phase were slated for a little bit deeper dive. And the mechanism by which we intended to do that was to invite a variety of vendors who play in this space and industry partners to give us some presentations and a little more insight into how they do business. We were fortunate that 2 such industry partners accepted the invitation, and we got some very good information from them. In addition, DHS, in the form of the Office of Emergency Communications, gave us some updated briefings, and the group had some spirited calls about how we get to costing models and how we determine the deployment options for the EC3. This is just a reminder of the architecture with a few minor modifications. Again, this is not intended to be a physical architecture for someone to go out and implement based on a specific element, but rather a high-level look at the conceptual model of the Emergency Communications Cybersecurity Center, the EC3. The idea here being that you must protect your networks before and as you deploy them, not after. And whether legacy systems or next-gen systems or transitional systems, all systems need to be protected. We learned a very hard lesson in October of this year when, for the first time in its history, 911 itself was the victim of a telephone denial of service attack. Using the simplest possible vector, a telephone, an individual was able to infiltrate 911 through the 911 trunks themselves and was able to cause serious issues with PSAPs in 12 states. The best way I can summarize that attack is that the phones did exactly what they were designed to do. They dialed 911. The networks and carriers and providers did exactly what they were supposed to do, and they processed the 911 call as a high priority call. The PSAPs did what they were supposed to do. They answered the call. In some cases, there were 200 calls against a PSAP in a matter of minutes. The simplest possible vector was used to infiltrate our system. We can no longer afford to ignore the fact that 911 is at risk, and we must protect it now, during the transition, and in the future. The EC3 concept allows us to do that in incremental ways. We can begin to implement with today's systems, move it into the transitional phase, and hopefully, ultimately, at the end state, have a protected and as secure as possible network, keeping in mind that nothing is 100% secure. But risk mitigation is what it's about, and finding a way to create a system that protects us to an acceptable level of risk is what we need to start concentrating on. That's what this concept is all about. The report addresses the fact that we detailed this in the first report, and in fact the first part of this report goes back over sort of a tutorial of what the EC3 is, what it's intended to do, what it's not intended to do, and then where we really get into the details and the meat of the second phase is how can we possibly do this and how much might it cost. For the costing models, I want to make sure that everybody understands these are highly variable. These are not definitive. The numbers that we put forth are based on some real-world deployments, but there are so many variables based on how this is deployed, how local and regional and state and potentially regional among state partners decide to build and deploy this, that all we could do is give a baseline with best guesstimate and then extrapolate from that baseline what a larger center might look like. The idea behind the numbers is simply to give decision makers at whatever level decide to implement this some guidelines and some points for consideration. One of the cautions is that, as with many technical systems or services, one of the most expensive and yet most critical elements is your personnel. And cybersecurity personnel are not inexpensive resources, but they are absolutely essential. So we have actually bumped up the estimates from the first working group report to account for the level of talent that it is likely that the EC3s will need in order to properly staff them. Again, not a definitive model, but we think it does have some qualified costs based on some real-world deployments. I'm going to apologize for two things specifically to Admiral Simpson at this point. One, we did not go as deep into Einstein as we had hoped to. However, we do make a recommendation in the report that consideration be given to an existing model and that there's additional work that can certainly be done. And there will be discussions internal to several organizations, and we will follow up with you on that. And the other is we did not have a chance, unfortunately, to do the privacy concern review that we had hoped to do. It would take some substantial legal expertise, we found out, to delve into some of the issues of privacy that the EC3 will undoubtedly have to address, whether it's personally identifiable information based on a call or based on the call data record created by the 911 center. There are elements of privacy on both ends of the spectrum that certainly need to be addressed. So it's a recommendation that follow-up work would include that, but unfortunately we just didn't get to it in this report. So, rough order of magnitude estimates. We initially in our first report said between $900,000 and $1 million a year for an EC3. We did some more digging. We got some, I think, good numbers from some very cooperative industry partners. Our updated estimates for a medium-sized PSAP, and that's 3 to 5 personnel, servicing several PSAPs of small to medium size, and accounting for a median amount of traffic, is at about $1.29 million a year. So, actually, closer to 1.3. We were pleased that the initial estimates seemed to be in the right ballpark. Keep in mind that a lot of the variables on that annual operating expense are going to come in the form of how much traffic is actually going to have to be analyzed. What kind of options do the PSAPs or the regions choose as far as what they want monitored, and how is that traffic and where is that traffic going to be monitored? In some ways, that cost can be mitigated based on strategic placement of sensors and the cooperative effort, to the Admiral's point, and we will stress this several times today, the cooperative effort and the sharing of cost, and the sharing of information, and the economies of scale that can be realized by doing this collaboratively. By doing that, you bring down the individual PSAP cost, and yet you get a substantial return on that investment by not only sharing the core EC3 services, but quite frankly, by sharing the information between those multiple agencies in such a way that when an attack occurs, it does not take 6 phone calls up to Washington, D.C. or Arlington, Virginia, and 3 or 4 hours, which is, quite frankly, a very fast response time for something like this. But it takes a matter of minutes for partner agencies to see real-world anomalies, identify what the threat and vector might be, and start an immediate response. By sharing those types of core services and that type of information, we really firmly believe that public safety would benefit on multiple levels. If you push that up to a large EC3, serving either several large PSAPs or a number of small or medium PSAPs, the cost could easily exceed about $2.5 million. And that's per year operating expense only. Again, a number of variables, and in the report we give you a table, and we list by types of traffic and amounts of traffic scanned and analyzed, by the types of services, whether an annual subscription or a one-off. We just give you kind of a model for what the cost might look like. That model can be used, any good engineer can take that math and make it look however she or he wants to. But the baseline is there, and it's some place to start, and it's certainly something that we hope dovetails with the excellent work done by Jim and Working Group 3 and the amazing work done by Dave and his group and Working Group 2 on putting this all together. So the costs are interesting. They're highly variable, but they're very real, and they have to be factored into building any next-gen system. And in fact, I would contend that they should be factored into improving any existing networks right now today, because we really do need to protect legacy systems starting yesterday.
Jay,
Sir.
Do those cost levels include the workforce to operate the EC3?
They do. The OPEX costs include the workforce and the monitoring and the sensors and the traffic. They do not, however, include all of the capital expenditures necessary to spin up the initial EC3. Two reasons we didn't do that.
On the OPEX first.
Yes, sir.
Is that a 24/7
It is.
Watch?
Yes, sir. It emulates exactly that, a watch. The manning would be based on peak times. Sometimes in the emergency communications world, your busiest time is not noon on a Monday, but it is 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. on a Saturday. So you can throttle the staffing based on the busy hour, much like you do in a PSAP.
So somewhere, I would imagine, between 5 and 7 FTEs to round out a 24/7 watch.
Small one 3 to 5, large one 7 to 10. But I think we estimated 5 to 10.
Sustaining a 24/7 watch with 3 FTEs. Please explain to me after the meeting how to do that.
Well, I've done it, unfortunately, with a PSAP, but the 3 FTEs and a supervisor.
Okay. And then you were going to discuss, in addition to OPEX, you had another comment about
yes, sir. The CAPEX was fairly straightforward. We didn't go into a lot of the CAPEX charges because it's so highly variable based on where you build and how you build. We stood by the recommendation and the information in the first working group report that basically said we would highly recommend reutilizing existing data centers that are open and available and may even have dark fiber and facilities available rather than building brick and mortar from the ground up. But we just couldn't find a reliable model that would give us anything beyond maybe a state level, so you'd have 50 different models. That cost is highly variable. What we did provide, though, is at least some insight into what the CAPEX might look like for deploying those initial sensors, what the cost of a typical sensor is, or a range of that cost, how many you might need per not PSAP, but per EC3 or per jurisdiction served. And again, a lot of that depends on how much traffic you want to monitor and what type of traffic. One of the things we did stress, though, is that it has to be voice and data, not one or the other, but both. And that requires two different types of sensor networks, and that incurs two separate costs, both of which were accounted for in that operational cost, both voice and data. Anything else, sir?
No.
Cover that one? Okay. So back to the slides. We had a number of resources that were incredibly helpful on this next front. Information sharing, we found, no surprise to those in the emergency communications business, one of the hardest things for us to do is communicate. And communicate from PSAP to PSAP, from region to region, from state to state. It's tough, especially when you got to pick up the phone and call your neighboring PSAP to tell them what's going on because you can't transfer the information via NextGen 911. Well, cyber is doubly so. Because we will have cyber incidents that will happen in neighboring jurisdictions, and it'll take not hours but days, and in one case weeks, for that neighboring jurisdiction to find out that a cyber incident had impacted a PSAP next door, and that's not acceptable. The information sharing environment that we are talking about in this report actually exists right now today. Through a number of mechanisms, there are ways for public safety to share information that are either not well known or not well used. Thanks to some very able assistance from my friend Joe Heaps, sitting on my right, with the Department of Justice, and Captain Michael Kennedy with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and Dusty Rhodes with DHS OEC, we uncovered a plethora of information sharing environment options for public safety. Rather than putting that in the body of the report, on Dusty's recommendation, very good recommendation, we included that in an appendix. Also in that, in a second appendix are some Department of Homeland Security resources that tie in with that information sharing environment, also referencing, of course, in both of those, the work that the FCC does in this space through the Ops Center and through this Bureau to tie all those pieces together. We provided that as a reference to public safety with clickable links that they can go to, whether it be to share information through the fusion centers, to share information through Department of Justice programs, through ODNI information sharing environment programs. There are a number of ways that public safety agencies could literally tomorrow start sharing information more efficiently, and it doesn't cost them anything to do it. Rather than waiting to build an EC3, rather than waiting to fully implement NextGen 911, we believe it's really important for public safety to take advantage of what exists today and then help these agencies, whether it's DHS, DOJ, or ODNI, build out better programs. Get the information flowing from public safety to the federal level and back. So that was one of our recommendations, is take advantage of the information sharing environment that exists and make good use of it. And what doesn't work, tell us so we can fix it.
Yeah. So Jay, just to, if you could provide some clarification that when you mean that jurisdictions can turn it on today, that's really more of the people-to-people information sharing, as opposed to the machine-to-machine, which is a much more deliberate effort that takes procurement of sensors and, in the case to truly be effective with a remote EC3 covering several PSAPs, potentially out-of-band communications to those sensors in those PSAPs, so that when the PSAP's down because of a cyber event, the EC3 isn't blind to conduct its task of helping to respond and recover.
Yes, sir. And in the report, there are two very distinct sections. So the implementation of the EC3 stands completely separate from the information sharing environment, and that information sharing environment is, yes, people to people, agency to agency, but not machine to machine. That does not exist. The ability to share information between us as humans does, and at least it's certainly a good head start on getting information propagated out to the community. And our position is that we need both. We should start with one immediately, and we should start thinking about building the other as soon as possible.
Thank you.
And thanks for the clarification. Yes, two very separate needs. We've addressed this one. So we made some recommendations, and in the interest of time, I'm not sure I need to read each one of these. I'm going to go through and give you a highlight on each of the 9 recommendations. We broke these into near term, mid-term, and long-term. Spoiler alert, the long-term is just build this darn thing and deploy it nationwide. That saved me about 3 minutes. Recommendation number 1 is look for a funded pilot to develop and deploy an EC3-like system. You can use existing models. You can even probably use some existing resources, and I'm sure there are willing PSAPs and regions that would gladly sign up to be part of this pilot. But we need to look for some funding and do the proof of concept and do the pilot. Recommendation number 2, again, the information sharing environment. Encourage the public safety communications community to get engaged in the information sharing environment now. It exists. If there are questions, there are a number of resources detailed in the report, and there are points of contact for each. The third recommendation is to support research into additional capabilities to integrate this stuff. We can't build 100 EC3s or 50 or even 3 and not integrate them with each other, because that defeats the entire purpose. Recommendation 4 is to investigate the deployment of the very sensors that you mentioned, sir, on both the voice and data side. Again, you can't defend one half of your house because the bad guys are going to get in the other half. So we strongly recommend looking at both voice and data. Number 5 is interesting, and it really kind of, we hope, meshes with what Dave Hull and his team have done. Encourage the 911 authorities to inventory what they have, not just their equipment but their systems, and to participate in the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Community Voluntary Program, one of those things that's detailed as a link, and start sharing this information and doing, again, an honest self-assessment of where they're at and what they need. The 6th recommendation is similar in that it encourages 911 authorities and PSAPs to investigate and discover programs mentioned in this report and in the First TFOPA report that are available to them today. Midterm recommendations. So as we've done a pilot and hopefully started the conversation and started people getting engaged in the ISE, the information sharing environment, next you develop a comprehensive plan or a roadmap to build out the EC3 or a cybersecurity core to protect next-gen 911 core services. I want to stop here and again reiterate something that Admiral Simpson has mentioned and that I think Working Group 1 mentioned many times. It's really important that you do not do this in a vacuum, that we not build this 6,000 times, because we can't. But that PSAPs and 911 authorities and regions and states sit down and have the discussion about the most effective way, both cost-effective and operationally effective, to deploy and protect next-gen 911 services, and then to allow that deployment to serve multiple PSAPs in whatever form the local governments decide they should take. If we build the core services and protect the core services at the same time, we will be much more likely to succeed in the cyber defense of next-gen 911. So in doing that plan, we encourage folks to sit down and have those discussions about what the most effective way to build this for your area is, not just for your PSAP. Back to the slides here. Recommendation 8 in the midterm is to do a gap analysis. Again, sort of a follow-on to the checklist. Recommendation number 9, and not trying to be controversial at all, but when we say require, what we really meant was probably recommend that carriers, vendors, app developers all participate in cybersecurity best practices when they're going to interface with next-gen 911 and PSAPs or public safety communications systems. The reason being that there are some best practices already established from places like NIST and others. Most of the vendors in the 911 space already use those best practices. What we're encouraging them to do is continue moving forward to defend their networks as part of the defense of next-gen 911. But also, as we see app developers come in and become an ever more important part of the ecosystem, that each of those app developers also follow those same types of best practices that the major players in the system today are following, to ensure that what we don't have is we don't have that one port that's left open that the bad guy can find and get in, that one flaw in an operating system that will allow an 18 or 20-year-old to write a simple JavaScript and suddenly compromise our network. So we are encouraging voluntary work in this area by all of the folks who play in the 911 space to make sure that we're basically all singing off the same sheet of music when it comes to cyber.
Jay, is it correct to assume that that sheet of music is best served by a commitment by all in the ecosystem to utilize the NIST cybersecurity risk management framework as that basic guide to allow a common risk-based language of what aspect of the threat are you covering down on versus what aspect I've got, what are we both looking at together, so that the identify, detect, protect, respond, recover risk elements are covered by all of the participants and communicated with each other in that information sharing that you described, so that folks know where risk is mitigated, where risk is accepted, where any residual risk lies.
Absolutely, sir. And the reason we didn't go into more detail on that is because we hit it so hard in the first report that we just stood on the fact that Working Group 1 firmly recommends that NIST framework be the foundational document for this. There's no doubt that is the framework that this supplemental report is still built on.
I was with Adam Sedgwick from NIST yesterday, and he assured me that in version 1.1, they've incorporated supply chain risk management as well. So important that as we go forward, the risk management framework includes that commitment towards understanding the provenance over hardware, firmware, software. In the next version, the 1.1 version getting ready to roll out, instead of having those two separate documents, has that embedded in the first.
Very good.
Thanks.
Sir. Back to the slides. And as I said, the spoiler alert. The final long-term recommendation is that whether you call it the EC3 or something else, we need to build this. And the end state is to complete the build-out and deployment of the EC3 concept on a national level, interconnect PSAPs, public safety communication centers, EOC, potentially organizations like FirstNet, into this cyber core defense, ensure across enterprise information sharing in near real time, and get everybody engaged in the process of securing the network first, operating the network in a secure environment, and sharing information throughout the enterprise and treating NextGen 911 like an actual enterprise. So those were our recommendations. And I can either pause for questions here or I can start the thank you list. I'll defer to you, Admiral.
I'll defer to Steve.
Jay, I have a question. Of late, meaning in the last 3 or 4 months, at a number of occasions that I've been at, and I refer to the whole deployment, this is Steve Satter's version, of the 5 pillars of NextGen 911. The device, the call handling equipment, the EZNet, GIS, and cybersecurity. And I do that simply for simplicity, because often I'm not necessarily talking to other 911 professionals, but I'm talking with electeds and appointeds and people that don't know what we know at the table here. The one thing that most often gets the question is the cybersecurity piece. And I'm probably the last guy that they should direct those questions to, but nevertheless I'm the guy there, so they do. And it surrounds the fact that there is, whether correctly or incorrectly, an assumption at the local level that cybersecurity is for somebody else to do. Whether that's Google, whether that's Sprint, whether that's Bank AmeriCard, but it's not for local government to do. And if it is for local government to do, well, that's what IT does. And it's caused me to wonder aloud, and now in front of this group, would we be better served in highlighting the importance of that by, in fact, not assuming that everybody that hears a term knows what we know, but instead call it simply 911 cybersecurity, to give it its own sub-identity so that when people think about deployment, they can appreciate the fact that this is over and above or different than they currently are thinking.
I don't think, Steve, that there'd be anything wrong with that other than wanting to make sure that folks understand it's still cybersecurity, even though it's specific to 911. And I think, in fact, to your point, one of the reasons we came up with the name EC3 was to make sure folks understood that this cyber segment is specific to emergency communications. And it is a very important point to remember that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, from the line telecommunicator on day one to the director of the largest center in the country. Everyone has a shared responsibility for cyber at some level or another. And that's why documents like the NIST framework and the NICE framework on workforce training are so important. And if nothing else, if the effort of Working Group 1 at least elevated the awareness of cyber in the 911 world, then we've done, I think, some good. But yes, I think that we should continue to push the fact that this cybersecurity effort is specific to 911, and it needs to be. And it's no longer somebody else's job. They have to understand, decision makers have to understand that we have to protect 911 as an enterprise. In the case of one PSAP that I was fortunate enough to be the director of, IT didn't touch any of the internal systems, but they owned the network that many were carried on. So it was dual responsibility. We had to protect both levels. But we couldn't throw the ball over the fence and say, yours, because nothing inside the PSAP could be secured by that external IT entity. And yet everything that transversed out of the PSAP was. So there were dual hats to be worn there. It's an excellent point.
Let me offer and ask as a question to receive validation that also, though, doesn't mean that a well-formed, robust security operations center for multiple counties, states' IT operations might not efficiently and effectively incorporate EC3 as a module within that larger security operations center concept. The important piece is that there is unique equipment that is 911 specific. There are unique vectors in. There's a unique set of adversaries that is fundamentally different than just the normal day-to-day IT that needs to be accounted for. And so whether the EC3 is a standalone entity covering many PSAPs or a module within a larger SOC organization, both would be acceptable as long as they've covered down on that uniqueness of the 911 challenge.
Absolutely. And in fact, the way we intended the model to work, sir, was just that. It doesn't have to be standalone. It most certainly can be modular. I don't want to use the term plug and play because it's not. If it was, we'd have them already. But at the implementation level, the concept of plug and play still applies. If you have a SOC, if you have a fusion center that has a SOC, if you have programs like currently exist that are deployed that are monitoring multi-state traffic, all of those are viable options for plugging the EC3 component in and ensuring that that subset of users in the 911 world are protected as part of the overall public safety architecture. And in fact, one of the things we encouraged in the first report and reiterated in the second was that entities like EOCs and FirstNet and others could become part of this overall infrastructure protection effort. So there's no limit on how you deploy that as far as the partnerships that you employ. And that's actually a very important point to be made.
Thank you.
Yes. David.
And I think you'll see some of the same things as we start talking about transitional things in our report, too. And I think one of the reasons is we're still living in largely a legacy world. And in that legacy world in 911, the local IT folks secure their own box, basically, that they live in. And they don't have to think about somebody else's box. Whereas as we start combining all of these IT pieces together, that's when what Jay's talking about becomes a much bigger problem and a much bigger picture. Because now you have interdependent IT shops that have to really work with each other to secure their own their infrastructure. And I think that's the reason why we've had some slow development in Next Gen 911 also, because everyone is still, not everyone, but a lot of folks are still thinking in that legacy mindset. And until we actually get outside of that and we start seeing that as 911 authorities, we need to explore reaching out and working with other folks. We can still operationally maintain what we do, but we have to interrelate to other people and build that interoperability. And when we do that, essentially, that's when, what Jay's talking about and what we'll talk about is the escalation into 911 and the evolution into it becomes absolutely critical.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, David Firth.
Jay, I just had one question, which is about the information sharing portion of the report, because I took a quick look at the appendix, and you've clearly underscored the availability of a lot of different mechanisms for information sharing so that it's not necessary to invent a new one. I guess my question is, what's the decision that either individually or collectively that 911 decision makers need to make about picking from the menu that you've put out in the report? Does everybody have to agree on one? Are there multiple options here? This reminded me of going into the supermarket aisle and trying to pick cereal from the gazillion different varieties that are already there. And so I guess, does everybody have to pick the same cereal?
Well, if I could eat Captain Crunch, I would, but I get to do Raisin Bran. So I think that a lot of that list is very similar. There are a lot of things we'd probably all like to eat off that list, but they may not apply, or they may not be healthy for our particular center or sector. The reason we provided that rather exhaustive list, and actually that's only about half of the resources that we were presented with, is so that the agencies could look and kind of not just an agency, but multiple agencies all the way up to the regional level could look and decide what applied to them. There are some law enforcement specific programs in there that may not apply to a fire EMS PSAP or a fire EMS region. There are some fire specific or fire service specific information sharing segments in there. We wanted to provide more rather than less, and also in that list, I think what you'll see is that at the end of most of those short descriptions, there is a list of the partner agencies at both the federal and state and local level. So if your partner agencies are DOJ and the fusion centers, good chance that's a law enforcement type of link. And in the description, we've tried to provide sort of a synopsis of that. I would say, though, that there are a couple that apply across the board. And those are the ones dedicated to cybersecurity information sharing, and we sort of pulled those out and let them stand alone. So it is an excellent point. Yes, sir, there are a lot. We tried to give as much targeted information in a short blurb as we could to sort of help guide the agencies. But if you'll look at the title of it and then at the bottom who the partner agencies are, that may give you a little more guidance as to what to choose.
Thank you.
Excellent point.
Jay, back to my point, and not to belabor it all, but I'll leave it to you and the commission in the final edit if you think anything would be helpful to include something along the lines of perhaps 911 cybersecurity, hereinafter referred to as EC3, or just something that gives a little focus to
Sure.
that.
Yeah, some branding. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? So now I get to say my thank yous after 24 months. Probably the last time I'm here for
Let me go to the bridge, if you will, quickly. Anybody on the bridge for
almost done.
Jay? Thank you. Back to Jay.
Okay. So first of all, on behalf of Working Group 1, I'd like to thank Admiral Simpson and your whole staff and the Commission for this incredible opportunity. 24 long months, but also some amazing work. I was fortunate to have a very smart team and some folks who really spent a lot of extra hours and a lot of extra time that they probably didn't have to do some work that they probably didn't think they were going to be doing 24 months ago. And I've called out a couple of those who were particularly helpful in this particular iteration, Dusty and Joe and Mike Kennedy. And in fact, without Dusty, half this report wouldn't have gotten written because he took it upon himself to correct me in some of my incorrect assumptions, and we had some good conversations. But the entire working group did, I think, some wonderful work, and I want to thank all of them, many of whom are sitting here, for all the help that they gave and for putting up with me for 24 months. I have a statement also as an APCO representative. So as most of you know, for about 22 of the 24 months, I represented APCO as an APCO employee, and I'm pleased that I was still allowed to represent APCO for the last 2 months, now employed elsewhere. But APCO also appreciates the opportunity to have been included in the valuable work done by this group. APCO also encourages public safety, the FCC, and industry to continue this important discussion. They would hope that all parties will focus on a realistic, achievable plan for the implementation of Next-Gen 911, using consensus-based accredited standards as the foundation of that plan. It's also critical to recognize the importance of local agency control while still striving to achieve interoperability through the use of common core services where practical and available. This approach will allow agencies across the country to work together in a collaborative fashion using an open process that will be beneficial to public safety users at all levels. And again, APCO is thankful to have been part of this conversation and exactly that approach. And lastly, personally, Admiral Simpson, a little over 2 years ago, I got a phone call from you on my personal cell phone. And I didn't even ask him how he got the number because I didn't want to know. But I was offered the opportunity to chair this working group. And I can't tell you what an honor that was. First, I was a little surprised, but not only was it an honor to be asked to chair the group, but just to participate in the work. Having worked with you and your staff, and having the Commission and the Bureau place that level of trust in all of us, I can't tell you how much I appreciate now, 24 months later, the incredible opportunity that I personally was given. I want to thank you, sir, for that chance. Also, David and Tim for the guidance that was provided and the very able and professional assistance in doing it right. And lastly, Steve Souter. I am not going to go into nearly the level that the Admiral did, but your friendship, your guidance, your professionalism, and your counsel in this entire endeavor and even before is invaluable to me. So as you move on, because you're not retiring, you're going to do something else, and we all know it. As you move on, please take with you my sincere thanks as a public safety peer and now as a federal partner for everything that you have done for this profession and for me. And know that I am eternally grateful for your guidance and for your allowing me this opportunity as well. And with that, I want to say thank you again, and I will turn it over to Mr. Souter.
And you should know that with the new job that Jay has, he and his wife have moved to Fairfax County. So I am pleased to say, at least for the next 7 days, that I am your 911 director.
You know, Steve, I'm starting to think here that this is a distinguishing element of where folks would choose to purchase real estate. Mm-hmm. That well-run next-gen 911 counties increases home values.
With ample cybersecurity, too.
Yeah. Jay, please extend our thanks. And I think I speak for Steve here and the others as well, to Derek and the APCO board. There's a lot of follow-on work that clearly needs to be done in cybersecurity. It's a tough challenge. Yes. And I think that the work that APCO has embarked upon this next year in Project 43 that will define the objective operational concepts for the PSAP of the future will hopefully intersect, and each will inform the other with the cybersecurity work you've done and the additional operational concepts that Project 43 brings to bear, so that is built from the beginning with cybersecurity in mind. So thanks so much to Derek and the APCO team.
Thank you, sir. And Jay, lastly, you've heard me say this before, too. Early on, April Hines and myself didn't know anything about this stuff. But you have coached us and you have mentored us, and I don't feel quite as inadequate as I was in those early days. I hope you feel the same way, April. Absolutely. Right. Good. Will anybody entertain a motion to accept the work product of work group number 1? David Hall, thank you, sir. Second. Dusty Rose, thank you, sir. Any comments? All in favor? Aye. Aye. On the bridge?
Aye.
Aye.
Very good. Thank you. We'll consider that accepted. My clock puts us at about 25 minutes ahead of schedule. We can do a couple things. We can take a quick break right now, or we can plow ahead. And for those of you that have travel plans, maybe give you the opportunity to get to wherever you may be sooner. I have no preference.
Why don't we get back together at 3? Take a quick break.
Okay, it's 10 of now for all practical purposes. We'll take 10 of the 15 we were allocated and come back 15 minutes before we were supposed to break. Great. We're ready to start anytime you are. You've all heard the Christmas carol, Christmas Eve in Washington, only equal to Friday afternoon in Washington. So.
No, but we're going to try. Actually, I did mention it at the end, but we just need to circle back on it. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you for being so prompt. The next order of business is a presentation from work group number 2, and David Hall. David.
Thank you. I think I know there's a lot to do at the end of today, so I'll brief with my. I'll start with my thank yous. As Jay was speaking, I recollected back to almost 2 years ago when Admiral Simpson called me as well. And said, would you be interested in chairing this working group? And I was like, sure, that'd be great. Little did I know the odyssey that would come before me over the next 24 plus months. It has been a fantastic adventure, to say the least. Working with some of the folks on this working group and their expertise has been phenomenal. So I appreciate the opportunity. Steve, as our leader, has been outstanding. So it's been a real pleasure, and as Jay said, an honor working with you through this. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank David and Tim especially for some of the conference calls and helping talking us off the cliff. There were some trying times that some of us remember. But it all worked out in the end, and I think the products that were delivered are just beyond excellent, top notch, and I think they'll provide PSAP's elected officials, the 911 community, and the industry some great guidance moving into the future. So we're very pleased to be able to offer this up. So and the working group members, as I said, were outstanding as well. So appreciate that moving forward. So with that, and without further ado, we can go to the title slide, and then the next slide actually is the working group to leadership, many of which we've talked about here. And I'd have to talk, Michael Connolly I know is not here, but Michael was also, especially for the first phase of this, was on every single conference call almost, and provided great leadership and great guidance as we move forward. And then the second slide is the working group members. And as I mentioned to you, they were just phenomenal in their approach to this and their expertise as they lended to it. So you can see on there, too, some of them were designated subgroup members, leaders, rather, and 3 of those are here with us today. The leads, Alicia, who did what we consider to be working group to subgroup D, which did the ESINet, and then we also had Jeff Wittick, who worked on one of the subgroup leaders, and Mary, who's sitting next to me, in April. So, and there's a number of others, and they're all listed there as well. So, without further ado, we'll move into the introduction piece to this. And this essentially is just, we can gloss over these pretty quickly, but the first piece is basically said that we were organized is an introductory slide, because we know that this will be posted, and so some of these slides we put in here knowing that some folks who are not on the call today are going to read this later on. So just to lay the groundwork and the foundation of what we are and why we did this. And then also a notation about the January 29th final report, because we think that what we have done as a supplemental is actually something that was unfinished work in the first evolution, and something that we think added to it and has done tremendously as a part of that as well. So, oh, good, someone's controlling the slides for me. So in phase 2,
I didn't know if you had.
Oh, no, I do, but that's fine.
Then it's back to you.
Oh, okay. So in phase 2 of TFOPA, we were charged with 4 tasks. And when I mentioned subgroups, these were basically where we divided the subgroups up. But the first was the readiness scorecard. And as I had mentioned earlier, the first evolution that we did, which got us to the final report, the combined final report, and our piece in there, essentially, we knew that we always wanted to complete as a part of that what we call the roadmap moving into the future. And having not had a chance to complete that, it was a perfect place in this second supplemental piece to actually not only build a roadmap, but to build the scorecard, which is the checkoff piece, and Mary will talk about that here shortly. The checkoff boxes for the evolution of what we see as transitional pieces to this. The second subgroup worked on the framework, and that was, he could not be here unfortunately, but Roger Hickson was instrumental in helping to move that forward. And Bill Merka's here with us today. He was instrumental in helping to move that scorecard forward as well. And another others, if I don't mention somebody, please, I apologize, but there was a lot of people working on these. Workforce staffing and training was another thing that we were tasked with doing, and April and Patty West had worked on a lot of those, and I know Patty's not here today either. But and the ESINet lessons learned from the early adopters piece, Christy and Alicia and a number of others worked on, and Fletch worked on very heavily, and I think that they're all outstanding pieces of work. But it was all part of us looking at what we called, in the first evolution of this, we called the Next Gen 911 ecosystem. Because what we came to understand through this was the title was PSAP architecture. And we came to understand that it was much bigger than the PSAP alone. That the PSAP was an integral part of what we were doing, but there was a bigger system in 911, especially in the evolution of Next Gen 911. As we said in legacy, it was really between the central office and the PSAP was the connection. And so it was a much more limited, controlled environment. But once we got to Next Gen and we started talking about, and we can go to the next slide, the component pieces. Oh, I have it. There you go. In the component pieces, when we started looking at things like the core services piece, and we saw the PSAP as an integral part of that, but it was a component. And then there were a lot of other factors coming into play, especially in the transition, because you will also have the originating service provider still providing information, but you will have an expanded role. So it will be now an originating service environment, because you will have other entities actually making calls available into the core services and into the system. And you will have the GIS piece that will be critical as well moving into that. Because everything will be routed through GIS, no longer through the phone company databases as they exist currently. So it becomes a much bigger picture of things that need to be pulled into place. So essentially what we found was that there will be a new paradigm, essentially, with Next Gen 911. And as plans for the implementation to continue, the 911 community will have an opportunity to embrace that, to take a look at where they are currently in a legacy world and look outside of that legacy box that they might live in currently. And they've provided outstanding service over the years. This is not saying anything about the service they provided. This is saying that there's a new evolution of the way to look at this and think about this. And they will have to build new partnerships outside of what was originally their own operation. And I think that's what Jay spoke to earlier, even with the EC3, that there will need to be collaborative relationships built outside of where they are now, so that they have, and we're not talking here about consolidation, we're just talking about, unless they choose to do that, but at the local level, they will collaborate on a much larger scale than what they're collaborating now through whatever they decided and established to be that entity or entities. So we looked at the current state. Today, many of the systems remain in what we call the legacy state, with a slow transition, as we saw in all of our discussions. And we talked about a number of factors, and these we said these might be factors, but it's not limited to these things. And that's the absence of agency buy-in, and we think that's largely because there's been a misunderstanding about what this is. What is Next Gen 911? It's a great term, but what are the component pieces? What are the things that we have to do? How do we get from where we are to that end state? And if everybody recalls, in the first, as we first started about this second piece, we talked about three pieces to that. The first was legacy. The next was what we called transition, where we lumped it all together. And then the second was the end state, like it was wherever we end up when we get through the transition. And I think that it was helpful looking at the scorecard, because what the scorecard ended up doing was evolving it, and Mary will talk about this, into a number of other transitional stages other than just transition itself. And that end state can be a local end state, can be a state end state, a local regional end state, or ultimately what it has to become is a national end state. And at that national end state, there are things in play outside of what anybody at a local level or a regional level or even a state level can wrap their arms around. But it has to be an interoperable end state, so that you can send calls, or send even calls we stumbled with as we talked about it, because you're really not talking about just phone calls any longer, as was in the beginning. You're talking about text. You're talking about other inputs into that system, whether it's a car in trouble, or whatever other service requests. So it becomes more of a service request than it becomes an actual call. So even as we talk about it, we're still talking about calls for service, when it's really more than that. It's a session-initiated something for service. So that becomes the new paradigm as we move forward. And these things there are a number of things that we said could be some of the factors that are slowing the process. But whatever we do, we need to overcome that slowness and move this forward. And again, we talked about relationships. We talked about the operating service environment, the core services being a critical element, and then ultimately the PSAPs. And everything has to come together, and everybody has to work towards that. So the path forward is in hopes that PSAP managers, 911 authority managers, elected officials, and everyone starts involving themselves in this process that we just talked about, whether it's end states regionally or end states at the state level, or whether it's the national level. All efforts have to be made to compress the timeline, because at the rate that we're moving now, as I think Steve mentioned earlier, it could be decade, 2 decades, it could be a long term. And as we know, with the current technology, the TDM technology being replaced, and those issues associated with some of that, the conversion from wire, essentially copper wire, to IP technologies and fiber. We know that there will be a point where industry is going to be pounding on the door saying, aren't you ready yet? And we're going to be saying, let's get this thing moving. So that's essentially where we are in this development, and that's why the scorecard, we think, is critical in telling them, here's where we are, or here's where you might be, and you can pick your place anywhere along that continuum that you are, but here's where you need to get to, and here are some of the element pieces that you need to use to get there. So with that, I'll let Mary actually talk about the scorecard.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon. I'm sorry that we don't have Jeff Whittick here, Roger Hickson, Bill Merca, April, and I. We helped co-chair these efforts. Hopefully I will do proper respect to the work that y'all have contributed. And I just want to make one observation. There's a few of us in this room that have been around a very long time. And around 1979, there was a report published at the federal level called Design and Costing of 911 Systems. The efforts these 2 years, we actually have the modern day version of that first planning guide. And I want to thank everyone that worked on this, because our country and its 911 authorities are in a tremendous position today. I don't know what I would have done without that first version to use as my planning guide. So good job, everyone, in putting a next-gen national planning guide together. So with that, I'm going to follow with what Dave had stated in terms of the scorecard. This portion of our report is pretty exciting to me, coming out of a planning entity. And deployment, you're able to take the scorecard from a 911 authority standpoint and move into, there we go, for stakeholders to really understand Next Gen 911, what they're going to need to do from a planning standpoint, and then be able to also budget from that. In respect to my friend Jeff Whittick, I want to go back and also recap building off of the 911 program office good works in terms of the maturity and the transitional stages as you advance through NG 911 readiness. There are, as Dave said, you start currently today, we're in that legacy foundation piece. That's your circuit switched environment, as we all know, and where traditionally it was an ILEC provided service. The next move in your step, and as you migrate forward, is the foundational state. In that second step, that's where your groundwork and planning is going on for NG 911 implementation is initiated. And you're going to see on the next slide how we're able to guide the planning and the governance environments for 911 authorities through these stages so they can check the boxes to see where they are to ultimate NG 911 readiness, which to me is an exciting point, because to be educated and informed and then know where they are in the process will get us to ultimately a nationwide end state. So from the foundational state, they then move into what is the transitional status, and that's where you're migrating partially from a legacy environment to a 911 network where you have IP infrastructure in place. You also would see in this transitional state your ESINet is deployed, and your ESN routing is still being utilized. As the authorities advance to an intermediate state, they begin to see all of the I3 core functionality in place, and call routing is also working within your GIS boundaries. And a 911 authority in the intermediate state, in all intents and purposes, is NG 911 ready. They are just not at the end state, which is when you would move through your jurisdictional phase. The jurisdictional end state is you have SIP interfaces, you have location information during call setup, you are working within interconnected ESINets, and then ultimately when we see the national end state is when all of the ESINets are ultimately interconnected, and we have a true national IP NG 911 system that works within all of the multimedia from region to region. As Dave said, you can start local, you could start regionally, you could be states, but ultimately we have reached nationwide NG 911.
So it strikes me, though, that a very practical, pragmatic step between jurisdictional end state and national end state is a state end state, right? Because so much of the decisions on resources available across the country will be state driven.
Resources and Admiral, you have that whole interstate element, right? And we talk about that in our document, because with our 911 systems today, a few may go and cross state boundaries in a legacy world, was fairly unique when that happens because of just the legal problems. So then part of this governance structure we're going to talk about in a minute is the state of the state, and the end state is you need to be thinking about crossing those basically interstate issues. So hopefully the folks who use these as their guide for planning will recognize all the various elements they've got to think about to get to that national end state. Dave, jump in there.
And I think having, and Darrell can maybe even speak to this, but having been formerly with NASNA, there are different states that are, they handle it differently. So in some cases you have a more localized, more regional control, when some states, based upon their state statutes, have taken more centralized control. So it will really depend upon what the state statute and what the state law is as to how it grows from that point, whether it is state controlled. I don't want to use control, but whether it's state coordinated or whether it's some other coordination. But in any way, and having been with the Pennsylvania system, we have a statute and we took large control over that, or coordination piece. But we also acknowledge the fact that at some point we're going to have to reach out to New York, we're going to have to reach out to Maryland, we're going to have to reach out to other states, because there will be an interoperability that will have to happen across state lines as well. Because we currently are sending local responders across state lines routinely. And that's being handled by the local PSAPs that are managing that dispatch movement. And I know Steve gets into that, even in the Northern Capital or National Capital Region. So I think that's why when we put this together, we discuss governance in a way that allowed for who your partners are to be determined almost at a local level. But what has to happen is there has to be an interoperability of the technology piece for that to even happen.
Okay, so the jurisdictional end state can be both. It can be statewide from a governance standpoint,
Yes.
while still supporting technical integration across state lines.
Right. Yes.
And using Pennsylvania as an example, I'm just thinking Philadelphia, Newark, communities around that part of the corner, while West Ham and the Northern Tier have linked up technically, that those are interim jurisdictional end states, that it would be absolutely legitimate to have a state governance element of that and a technical connecting of ESI nets where it makes sense across boundaries.
Absolutely. In fact, we saw some of those discussions when I was with the state, because there was some southern New York counties that were interested in joining because they routinely sent resources across state lines. So there's no reason that, unless there's some, regulation reason, but there was no reason why you couldn't have shared core services even across state lines. And potentially even smaller states may join together as a more of a regional concept among states in order to supply that also. We came to the understanding that core services in and of themselves are going to be extremely costly in a lot of ways. And so not every PSAP and or every regional group may want to do that. They might maintain their core ESI net structure, join ESI nets together, and then ultimately share core services somewhere. So it really will depend upon how those partners communicate with each other and what they see as the best evolution to get to their end state, and who they partner with in order to do that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So working off of the maturity model, let me go next slide. Pardon me. Okay. Within the actual framework for the scorecard, we identified certain essential elements that were critical to the planning and the deployment. You'll see on the screen, I'm not going to read all of these, but just as an example, and I'll show you what the scorecard's going to look like here in just a second, example of it. But it covers everything from the governance element, so you have the proper framework in place, to security, to operations. So as I'd indicated earlier, someone who's actually planning and being brought in on putting a region together can take this document and know that we've hit all the high elements, the critical elements. Not to say that there's probably not some that we may have missed that was unique to a specific area, and we didn't intend to be all-inclusive because it would have been difficult to do that. But we believe today we will hand the Commission a thorough document for planning and scoring an area. This is an eye test for you. This is the summary page of the scorecard. So on the left-hand side, and I'm going to put my glasses on so I can read this. On the left-hand side is basically your elements of the scorecard. So you've got governance, as I'd indicated on that list, and on down to operations, optional interfaces, and then to the right, in terms of its structure, are the different phases of the maturity model. The next slide in the eye test for you, glad I went to the eye doctor last week, it's just an example to show you governance. So within the governance checklist, Tim, I see you squinting and you have your glasses on. That's not good. That's not good. Within governance, in the areas of interest, you would have governance structure, design and framework, and then someone could say, planning, oh goodness, okay, do I have my governance structure, design, and framework in place? That may be optional in a legacy environment. However, as they move into foundational or they move into transitional, not having a governance authority in place in that structure is not an option. So it would remind them, even if they were new in the business, okay, I need to make sure I have that. Do I have a strategic plan? One of my favorite things in this business. A strategic plan might be optional in a legacy or a foundational. Remember, a lot of these folks have inherited, right? They've been in line for 3 or 4 decades now. But as they move into a transitional state, they really need to have a strategic plan. So that's just an example of the detail that's involved as they take this framework and go down it. The next, did I go forward there? The next one is just another example of the elements within the scorecard, taking routing and location. Selective routing. Yes, that's in a legacy world. Yes, it's in a foundational world. But if you're going to go into an IP selective routing environment, the scorecard shows you, well, if you're an IP ESN routing, then you're in the transitional state. Part of our issues around the country is, when am I NG 911 ready? So this should be able to help educate everyone and get everyone using the same terminology. And once again, the next one is just another example. This has to do with routing and location and the various elements that are contained, so that they understand all the piece parts, including alley and going on into a list. So they understand that framework. And then, as it also includes the National Forest Guide, which ultimately will probably come into play in the more advanced stages of the maturity model. Any questions on the scorecard? Since this is so tiny, I know you're having a hard time reading it. But it's basically the guide, the checklist for our 911 stakeholders. Another important component of our report, I'm going to go down one second. I'm working off of 2 computers here, guys. Bear with me. Okay, another important part of our report. Remember, in the first phase, we had a lot of really good work done on the NG 911 system, the ESINet, the core services. Well, Section 4 of the report, and Bill Merck could keep me honest, was to build on that, but at the same time also put in place another additional framework for planning of all of those elements. So you'll find in the report another dimension of planning and a scorecard, similar scorecard and template, is there are 74 elements in our report that deal with planning. So, and this is once again an example that you have to develop the authority, and you have to give it a name, and you have to have its purpose. So once again, your reader should not put this report down and not understand what are all the moving parts. in governance. And then I'm sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Just one quick point. And when we say authority, we don't mean you have to name it an authority. There's a lot of different models out there, depending upon state law and how state law would organize. Christie has her COG.
Right.
So you could have a council of governments option as your authority. Authority is really what's the governmental entity that's part of it. But you can have a variety of different names.
In fact, Dave, I'll build on that. I know we have one state, instead of having a state agency, they have the Association of Counties that's named as their authority for planning their statewide initiative. Whatever works, the way I think, Laura, you'll agree with this, it's whatever works to ultimately get to an end state of NG 911 in our country, knowing that you've got to go beyond your county boundaries and collaborate. State level, somebody owns it and helps plan it and has that authority. You may have some states, we have a lot of good, Daryl Fernazna, we have a lot of states with very good, strong planning legislation, but that may not be nationwide. So this will remind them to put those authority structures in place.
Mary, if I could just stop.
Yes, sir.
I'm getting some reports that the audio on the other side of the conference bridge is very low. And so some people are relying strictly on the webcast now. For those who are on the conference bridge and who may have questions, don't hesitate to email them to me, and then we can get them out here at headquarters. I'm at timothy.may@fcc.gov.
Do I need to get the mic a little closer, Tim? Is that on me? Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, we'll go back to the slides, please. Thank you. All right. As I indicated, we continued to build in this phase 2 of the report. The other important considerations that are on this list and this slide for you really all are around NG 911, the NG 911 experience from the technical side and the core services. We point out in this phase of the report and sort of reiterate that in an NG 911 core service environment, that could be vendor managed in terms of the deployment. It could be 911 government authority managed. Christie is another good example. Bob Brown, is Bob still in here? For New Hampshire, the state very much owns that as well. So it is, once again, a model and a hybrid, and sometimes it's a blend, but it will guide the stakeholders in understanding their options there. This part of our report and the update also talks about the originating service providers and the accessing into the networks. It goes in and does some additional explanation on understanding the terminology. Roger Hickson, if you're listening, Roger, God bless you, because you beat us about the head all the time of using the wrong terms. I think in 2 years we should be able to recite everything he says, but maybe we just should have called everything NG 911 for simplicity, but understand the terminology so we're all speaking the same language, and then you're also going to understand where you are in the transition phases. We have definitions in here. We also talk and give guidance in terms of understanding the resiliency, the redundancy of the networks, anticipate the sizing, the security. Once again, back to Jay English and security. That is going to be a critical point of these networks. They should, public safety needs to realize that they also have virtual LANs within their footprints that are going to have to be mindful of the security aspects as they deploy these IP networks and have proper firewalls and redundancy in place. The other thing that we talk about is, and this is the risk management portion, is doing the assessments, do the inventory of your networks and your components. If they monitor and if they test and they evaluate what they're planning on implementing and part of the implementation, they will continue to evolve and transition and migrate through the maturity models. The system sizing, we talk in the report as well, Bill, keep me honest on this, is understand what your capacity and the size of your system needs to be in the long haul, because we're going to be working in media, in data, in video, and so anticipate those things going in, and that kind of goes back to your strategic plan. We talked about this, Admiral, already on the cross-agency interoperability. You will have ESINet to ESINet interoperability with the proper governance structures in place, collaboration, planning, and partnership. You should not be surprised when it comes to the implementation aspects of getting those systems interoperable. And in Section 4 of Workgroup 2's report also has probably April and I and the group that worked on this in terms of the operational impacts. We can put all the technology in the world in place in these PSAPs, but it's those folks that have to make it operate that are probably the most important element of this entire project. And so I'm going to turn it over to April to pick up operational impacts. I'll pass the clicker.
Okay. Where operational impacts are concerned, I hope you're noticing, everything is kind of like flowing within this report. So we talked about, the introduction, then we went right into the scorecard. Part of the scorecard is operational impacts. As we talked about some of the technical pieces, the operational impacts are also part of that. So the NG911 impacts, deciding what resources will be shared, how the PSAPs will utilize those resources, the common NG911 core services systems will have administration and management of several functions at a central level. So all of that is part of this part of the report. Monitoring and managing, there will be a need for uniform method of interaction, interoperability, and collaboration. This identifies various different touch points and necessity for coordination for maximum benefit. But it also talks about, we talked about the necessity for the relationships with the interagencies, but this talks about the relationships with the vendors, the various different vendors that are going to be touching the NG911 system ecosystem.
So it strikes me that monitoring and managing is particularly critical to SLAs and ensuring that in your contracts you're getting what you paid for, that if you paid for 4 nines, that you're actually, that you have the technical capacity independent of the vendor to determine whether you got the 4 nines that you paid for.
Correct. Absolutely. And we do talk about that as we move through this. Additionally, back to the slides. All right. The next piece is PSAP operations in particular. We identify and we talk about the fact that PSAPs have historically been unique to each PSAP, and the fact that we need to start moving together and melding standardized operating procedures and being able to evolve to that next generation environment. Operational aspects of next generation 911, Mary talked about this earlier, but implementation planning is a necessity. It's going to be a necessity to create an implementation plan, naming a project manager, whether it's internally or you're using a vendor to do that. In addition, Mary kind of touched on this earlier, but there are certain governance pieces within each state. Not all states have this, but a lot of states require 911 plans. And the fact that if you are governed, whether it's by statute or regulation, by a 911 plan, you do need to look at that, and that does need to be updated. And then obviously, maybe it's not obvious to everybody, but operational impacts for the PSAP, including the PSAP operations itself and the training of your staff.
I think that last point is so important, and I'd like to foot stomp it. And just from my experience in the Navy, as we put together complex systems of systems capabilities that weren't just within a part of a ship, but were across the entire ship, and weren't just that ship, we're part of a battle group of ships
and it wasn't just ships, it was aircraft, and you get the picture, that for the longest time we would just roll out our technical description of, hey, this is the new system that's going to be version 1.1, or this is 2.3, and we didn't think in with enough discipline, how to communicate to the crew, the operations crew that was using that technology, and over time matured what were called capes and limbs. So with every technical new version of the plant, of the capability, 1.1, 1.3, there by discipline would be a capabilities and limitations document that was also 1.1 or 1.3 that was written specifically to speak to the operators so that they would know what their radar would do or wouldn't do in a way that the entire battle force could understand the impact of the technical change on a single ship. And it strikes me that in the PSAP world, particularly where we're talking multiple PSAPs now participating in cooperative arrangements for their ESINETs, as well as cooperative governance arrangements for how they resource things, and applications that may spread across jurisdictional boundaries, that it is very important to, in a disciplined way, communicate to the workforce so that they understand the capabilities of the new system, but also, if done right, the citizens served by that PSAP would better understand, hey, I can text to 911, but I can't MMS to 911, because they'll know in their vernacular what capability and limitation for the operational milestone that you've achieved means to them.
Yep, and actually throughout this report, that's one of the things that we have done is created many different lists of things for PSAPs to identify as they're going throughout this process, the various different things that have to be accomplished, including training, those various different pieces of training that have to be accomplished.
Great.
Next is technical considerations. I won't go too far into that, but the next one is processing system alarms. And this one is one that I really want to draw attention to because many of those who have already implemented transitional NG 911 have not completely been prepared for processing those alarms in the IP deployments. And it's really important that that piece gets covered. Next.
Yeah, so it's not just the alarms themselves, because these are machine-generated alarms, right, and you're going to have things that seem like nuisances. It's a tuning of the software that needs to occur so that you're regularly examining the nuisance alarms, figuring out why do we get so many of those nuisance alarms, eliminating those, and then lowering the threshold again so that you get more alarms, and within that you'll identify nuisance alarms. That tuning process can't be over-described. And West, we talked about some of this too, you guys. It's a tough challenge, isn't it? Yeah.
There's a couple of different other ones here. Data management. I won't get too far into the weeds with that, or GIS routing. But obviously, there are routing changes that will need to be handled differently during the different stages of next generation 911 deployments. MSAG Alley is another one that I don't think there's a lot of information out there where the PSAPs understand the change, the huge change there is in the MSAG Alley. The fact that NG will result in a much larger delivery data stream, and the fact that there are many more fields, and the fact and that there is training that is necessary. PSAP managers need to determine what is going to be displayed and what's not going to be displayed, and then how all of that affects all of your downstream systems, including CPE, CAD, logging, supplemental information, vendors, etc.
And the ANSI Galley is the perfect example of it's a database, so you've got to protect it. You've got to expect that at some point it'll be breached. You've got to be prepared to have a backup that you can restore from, and then a recovery plan on if the bad guy got into breach, he could probably get into your backup. So how do I ultimately recover and get the bad guy out of the system completely? And that's just one of the many databases that it takes to run a next-gen 911, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Then we go into NG 911 implementation planning. Mary talked about the strategic plan. This is where that strategic plan is absolutely necessary. Identifying the project prerequisites, clearly defining what all of that is going to be prior to the project beginning, including key factors like next-gen core service elements, databases, ESI.NET implementations, etc. And not to be left aside is also cost considerations, project timing, and delays, etc. And then we go into the actual staffing and training section, and that where staffing and training is concerned, technology has advanced the roles of and responsibilities of the public safety telecommunicator. Some in the industry believe that NG 911 technologies become available. As they become available, they will put the public safety telecommunicator in the incident scene itself. There are going to be difficulties with hiring and retaining qualified employees, and that in particular may dramatically increase. Admiral Simpson said in the September meeting that PSAP environment is changing. It's beginning to look a lot like a DoD command and control center. And the command and control center must take in a tremendous amount of data and information and handle that very rapidly. Well, the onset of NG 911 technologies will also require 911 authorities to consider the hiring and additional staff to fulfill requirements not present in the current systems. Training currently given to telecommunicators around the country varies widely. Standards relate to personnel and training do exist, but have not been implemented on a national level. There are PSAPs that operate using best practices or guidelines for both staffing and training. Many of the documented standards that exist for staffing calculations, which are relatively comprehensive, may not sufficiently address the additional data elements that are necessary to determine future technologies in the NG 911 world. These new data elements may include the length of time it takes to process a new incident, and other administrative and supportive positions that don't fit into staffing formulas. This working group identified many of the existing staffing documents that are currently in use, as well as many that are being developed currently. There are many factors to incorporate into staffing when looking at appropriate metrics. The purposes of this report is not to specifically determine or list all of the factors, but to help PSAP decision makers to identify the needs of their staff and the new skill sets they will need as they transition to NG.
April, thank you so much for describing that. I will be signing a letter. Actually, I'll be doing the final review tonight and signing it Monday to send to OPM's group that does the standard occupational classifications and describing the telecommunicator role. I intend to include the TFOPA reports as appendices to that letter to help make clear the evolved nature of the telecommunicator position, as well as the tremendous value to the nation of an update to the SOC reflecting the right build to
skill sets for that position. So thank you all for allowing me to draw upon this work to make that communication.
Excellent. And that's the end of my portion. Now it's on to Alicia.
We'll go to Daryl in the corner. Daryl?
Thank you, because I think this is a good time to add this before we get to Alicia's presentation. Since NASNA was brought up a couple of times, I wanted to kind of add on and back up Mr. Hall and Mary and April's discussion of specifically the difference between jurisdictional end state and state end state. I think what you find, and as Alicia will describe in her presentation, there have been a lot of success stories both at the state level and a sub-state level scope. And as you look from state to state, the governance model, as David said, varies greatly from state to state. And I think that that's one of the beauties of the federal system that we have, is that each state can find its own best way to move forward. However, I would also say, because I believe you would agree with this, Admiral, that while each state can and should find its own best way to move forward, that should not become a excuse for inaction. While they can and should find their own best way to move forward, they do still have to find a way to move forward. But whether that is by moving forward from a state-level coordination or from sub-state regional coordination entities, or even, as David mentioned, as the possibility, some states may find that the best way to move forward would be to group together with surrounding states and work together towards implementation. I think that you're going to see a lot of variation across the country in that. But I also want to make sure that we don't forget that the variance among the states should not become an excuse for inaction.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. And let me associate and agree with your remarks. The variation in governance for 911 has delivered an amazing nationwide capability that was very efficiently matched to what communities needed and the resources communities had to put towards 911. And I think the work that you've all engaged in suggests that there can and should still be variation in ensuring that 911 best meets the needs of individual communities. But we should not wake up one day as a nation and lose the universal aspect of what has become 911, to where you drive a couple counties away to enjoy some time in a state park camping, and that's when you have your emergency. And a next-gen 911 capability not only isn't supported in that area, but is potentially supported in a very different manner. We need to keep in mind we're a mobile society. We love the fact that we can drive anywhere across our great country and ensure that the end product, celebrating and valuing that diversity of how we built it, delivers a common capability that for the core elements of Next Gen 911 doesn't require a cheat sheet to see what the capabilities would be county by county.
And if I can add one more thing to that, I know that as we look across the country and each state has its own governance model, what the level of responsibility and authority that's found within those different governance models varies as well. And so when we say that you have to, for this level of implementation, there has to be a governance model in place, well, just saying that by itself doesn't necessarily tell them what they need, because there may be a governance model, but it's insufficient in terms of either its responsibilities or its level of authority. So having a document that outlines what that responsibility and authority needs to be, I think, is essential, and that's hopefully what we've helped produce here today.
April, I was particularly intrigued by, I think it was slide 28 and 29, the last two you did. For those of us in the PSAP world that are there every day, talking to call takers and dispatchers and talking to cohorts, the staffing component is one of the biggest unknown. Everywhere I go, it is the first thing that my peers want to talk about. How are we going to manage this if we're having challenges today recruiting for legacy 911? And there was in a 911 center on Monday of this week, one of the biggest in the country, they had 87 vacancies. 87 vacancies. It scares me. So when you look to the challenges and the opportunities that go with Next Gen 911, they are abundant, particularly on the challenges part, And everything that you said in these two slides, I've heard said over and over again. And if I don't mind, but I'm going to borrow the Admiral's phone for a moment. But many call takers and dispatchers and directors have said, how am I going to teach my people to, in the future, say, look how bad this wound is, look how bad they've been shot, look how bad they've been burned, whatever it may be. So you have here another component, aside from the training and the recruitment and all of that stuff, but the psychological long-term impact.
Trauma.
This is not going to be an isolated occasion. This is going to be every day a solid dose where today all we hear is bad stories in our ear. Tomorrow we're going to be hearing those bad stories and unfortunately seeing many of them on the screen as well. So how do you manage that? Is it important that the call taker see that? Where does the field unit be the primary person to use it? Is the call taker going to have to assess all this information? We've got existing standards, NENA, NFPA, and others that say you have to do X, Y, by Y, and now we have all of this other stuff. And how do you juggle that and determine what is more important, the clock ticking, putting units on the field, or assessing data now that you may not be clear, the liability that goes with miscalculating or misviewing something and say, I thought it was a gun and it wasn't a gun, and all that stuff. So it's going to be a challenge, but not to be dissuaded from doing it because we have to do it. But thank you for so well highlighting it, particularly in slide 29. Yeah.
So that virtual reality enabled by all the neat new capabilities Next Gen 911 becomes an actual traumatic reality, if not done right, or an actual stressor reality that the workforce is just going to have to deal with. Just thrusting upon their shoulders without training, without bringing elements of the system in that help reduce where they can the traumatic aspects of that, without thinking about counseling and those kinds of services after an event. We have to think about this holistically, right, as the greater capabilities reduce the safety risk in a community, and I'm convinced they will reduce the safety risk and be a great benefit to citizens, that it can't be at the expense of the workforce. We've got to prepare them for that.
I mean, it's been said many times at this table in past meetings, the most important person in the whole continuum is the person under the headset. Yeah.
Which is now, I hate to beat a dead horse here, but it's more than the headset. Have you guys seen the commercials that the latest new gadget for Christmas, right, is the virtual reality goggles? Well, the telecommunicator in a fully realized next-gen environment will have that virtual reality on the 4 flat panels in front of their face, right? As they're pulling up not just now the picture map. 2 years ago it was great because in addition to just having the street map, you got the pictures of the residents you were sending the officer to or officers to. But now, today, in many PSAPs across the nation, that PSAP operator can see the cameras that real time are available where the caller is and engage live time video so that they can observe the actual scene. It's tremendous in the ability to better understand what's really going on and to add value from that position. But as Steve alluded to, it's a whole new additional range of skill sets, of multitasking, and potential to have some really stressful and potentially traumatic elements of that, of delivering upon that additional element of risk reduction for our community.
A call taker I spoke to recently, they said that they looked at themselves in the future as being a bobblehead. And I said, what do you mean? And currently they had 6 screens, okay? 6 monitors.
Oh, I'm too short.
They were adding 2 more on top of the center 2, So the bobblehead comes from this all day long. And if you think about it, that in itself, you talk about carpal tunnel syndrome and some of the things that we all experienced in the past, just think about that dimension of it. So, yeah.
So send your kids to chiropractic school.
And Nina will figure it out, and Apco will figure it out, and we'll all be good.
And Mr. Heath, who started out as an ops officer in the...
Yes, Joe. Joe, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Just one comment to what you said, Steve, and Admiral, to what you said. I think the most important thing is that as the decisions are made as to what the call taker sees, those decisions may be different in the 60-500 that the Admiral mentioned.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to hear is a vendor say to me, they will never need that. Well, Mr. or Mrs. Vendor, that's really not your call. That's the people who are going to read the information that we've put out and make the decision, and it may be 6,500 different decisions as to what any of my customers at the call taker position, at the dispatch position will ever need. And I think the flexibility that this document talks about and allows those decision makers at all of those different places, I think that's one of the great strengths of the work that's been done by this group.
Thank you, Joe. Any other comments? Yes, Dan?
Just to add one other comment in the thinking that you were going down on Admiral and Steve, Joe, is as part of the planning, we have to address what's the governance from the decision making. As you're immersed now into this situation with all the information, who really is in the best position to make decisions? And what is a call taker now going to do in terms of making those decisions versus someone who's on scene from the traditional sense of what they do today?
So Dan, that's absolutely right. And some have heard this before, but when I was in San Bernardino just a couple months ago and spoke to the PSAP supervisor who was on duty at the time of the San Bernardino shooting, and spoke to the first officer on the scene, who just happened to be the PSAP director. In that case, it's a uniformed officer who's the PSAP director of the San Bernardino PSAP, and he was out to lunch, as he said, just enjoying the day. But he was out to lunch 2 blocks away from where the shooting happened. And so the PSAP supervisor, who happened to be the senior supervisor, fortunately, for San Bernardino, although she said any of my supervisors could have done it, she's modest, dispatched her boss to be that first officer on the scene. And he said that his world immediately kind of collapsed around, think of Maslow's hierarchy. Right. First, stay alive. Second, make sure that the officers arriving on the scene to help support him stayed alive and worked out. But a planning horizon of 30 seconds to a minute. And it was the PSAP supervisor who had the planning horizon of 5 minutes, of 10 minutes, of an hour. It was the PSAP supervisor who recognized and correlated that, hey, we have a SWAT exercise with 2 other jurisdictions going on right now with our armored vehicles that PSAP supervisor stopped the exercise and said, hey, stand by, get ready to go to the scene. It's developing, and more later, and then ultimately task them. That's not the traditional decision point, which in the past put all of that on the on-scene commander to be the one that would make all the calls, because the perception would be, well, they're in the best position to understand what's really going on. There were aspects of that situation where it was the
PSAP supervisor at that given time who had the best situational awareness of all the different moving parts that needed to be orchestrated to ensure that the optimal risk-considered approach to that response was affected. And the team of those two individuals and how they worked in San Bernardino is a wonderful case study, and I would encourage all in this business to think about just what you raised, Dan, is that the where decisions are made in the future, I would suggest needs to be agile.
Alicia, did you hear?
If I can just, we actually spoke to that actually in the first report, where we had a position in the PSAP which was really an analyst position. So it was an evolution from telecommunicator right to analyst, because that's really where real-time crime and or real-time command ends up starting to happen with that integration of all of those services. So I think it's all critical points to that we need to look at the expanded role of a 911 center or a PSAP when it comes to, as Admiral, as you said, situational awareness and getting the right resources from the right places. And it has to look outside of that individual PSAP as well to those around, because that might be where the resources are that you need to bring in.
Okay. David, we're back still to your report.
Alicia.
Okay. We keep terming this as ENET lessons learned, but early on I'd like to think of it as those early adopters. And I brought this to this group because, based on my own personal experience, I'd like so many of us in this room have been attending everything we can and trying to understand NG911 and all its pieces, parts, or elements for years and years and years. And you go to all these events and you just soak in as much information as you could, but I never had really experienced anyone who'd ever actually done it. So I got the opportunity several years ago now to actually, in Oregon, hear someone speak. Christy came out and gave a presentation to a group, and her presentation was about her experience in actually deploying it. And I went away awestruck, and I kept talking about it to anyone who'd listen, simply because I loved the way she termed it. She termed it a journey, and she spoke about how there was really no one to go to, that they were working through the issues. I really just came to respect what she was talking about, because there really wasn't anyone that she could just pick up the phone and call. And for almost every sentence she was saying, there was something I was picking up on. There was so many helpful hints. The first line of her sentence one time was, we ended up keeping 50% of our camera trunks. I mean, it was just everything she would say, I'd be like, oh, wow, really? And it got you thinking, and I was just so impressed. We in the public safety field love testimonials. We really want to hear from the real world and how it really worked. And I just really respected that, and respected how she plowed ahead and made that journey as an early adopter. So as soon as I heard that, I really wanted to bring that going forward to everyone, to pass on as many helpful hints and glean as much information from her pain and everything, so people wouldn't have to go through it again. So I was fortunate enough to bring it back to this group, and they asked me to go ahead and move forward with it. I took that with a lot of responsibility, because there is so much information and how to glean it. So what we came up with is coming up with a series of entities that we approach. So we got some participants to join us in this, and we actually now there are a pool of people who have implemented or deployed. So of that pool who have, we chose different scenarios. So hopefully going forward, those who do read this report and can be privy to this information, that they might have one that reflects something similar. So of the entities, we picked 9. Of the 9 that we picked different situations. We picked a fire entity, a local entity, a statewide deployment, a large deployment like the state of Massachusetts. So I'll run down the list. We picked the state of Maine, Iowa, the state of Iowa, Commonwealth of Massachusetts that had like 267. We picked a single entity, Palm Beach County. We picked a COG, Christie's COG in north central Texas. Then we picked a local regional situation in Boulder, statewide deployment in Indiana, but Indiana was unusual because this is a second ESENet, a redundant ESENet, so we wanted to benefit from that information. The state of Minnesota, and then we picked a fire department situation in Verdugo in Southern California. When we looked at the entities too, we wanted to glean as much information and helpful hints to pass on to the next person as possible. So we came up with kind of a common set of questions or benchmarking questions that we came up with, and then we held these interviews kind of interview style, and we debated originally kind of how to get the most information and do this, but we ended up with the interview style. And I have to stop a second and thank some of my members of my group, Christy Williams and Daryl and Bill, Chuck Spalding, Joe Heaps, and Ron, and specifically Mark Fletcher. Bless him. He is such a great interview style. He was able to speak with each one of our participants and our interviewees, and it really led the conversation. So thank you very much, Mark. But we just wanted, of those early adopters, and each one of them also talks about how this was a journey and how it's not just a deployment and you have a cutover and then that's it. Each one of them remarked that it truly is a long-term journey, evolution situation. So we were very fortunate in that. I'm going to go ahead and pass on to Christy, who's going to speak more about each one.
So of these 9 interviews, I would submit to you that they could be perhaps be considered unofficial pilots. They proved concepts. They proved different concepts, and nobody has the whole shebang, but they took a step forward. And during our process, we had some feedback. Oh, well, let's not include them. That wasn't a good implementation. They had lots of problems. Well, guess what, guys? Every early adopter ran into lots of problems. The fact that they persevered and completed even a portion of or a component of NextGen tells me that they were successful. And so our group took the stand that any implementation was a good implementation with lessons learned. And so therefore the input and feedback from these individuals would be valuable. We did see that the biggest common theme through all of the interviews, and this is a very good thing, could have been risky. The good thing was that the common theme was that everything in this report, those are the things that these people highlighted as being so important. So I remember with my implementation, people saying, well, that's pie in the sky. I don't know. Nobody's really done that. They're all just talking about it. It was having resources in this room and other resources, the collaboration that Nina afforded us through their standards work and the ability to join all these committees in an early stage that gave me the confidence to move forward as an early adopter. And so having a standards-based solution was a commonality among our interviewees, but they all had very unique experiences. Daryl talked about the different variations from state to state or jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that's exactly what we saw. As an early adopter, when I would read about what the next interview would be, I often thought, oh, well, that one won't apply to me. There was not one interview that I did not pick up more than one things that I took note of, went back and checked, put on my roadmap. All of the interviews were extremely valuable. So just to highlight a couple of the different things that were commonalities is the planning aspect. During the planning aspect, I think the big things that we heard over and over were the importance to have the availability to have phased planning and phased implementation, and we heard that from Mary in her earlier report, as well as the resource needs. And really, we got both sides of that resource thing. We heard from people that utilize managed services, and so their need for resources were less, and those that did more owned and operated that had to do internal resource enhancement prior to the implementation. And I think for planning, the biggest takeaway for me was the documentation that everybody had kept and was willing to share. So I probably, of all the early adopters, I probably did the worst on documentation. But there were so many documents referenced, and every interview they would reference a document and say, oh yeah, and we're going to put that on our website, or we'll share that with anybody that asks. We've got it on a thumb drive, whatever it was. Documentation is now being created, and it's available for everyone. The next component was the procurement, and with procurement, we learned about different aspects of things to include in an RFP, the different requirements that needed to be in it to be sure that you planned for contingency planning and future expansion, and most of the things, again, were earlier in this report, so you have greater detail on how to do those things. And of course, something that was repeated over and over was the need for a sustainable system. It's one thing to build it, but guess what, guys? You've got ongoing bills and ongoing resource needs, both in the PSAP and at an administration level. So those were the common pieces of that category.
Christy?
Yes.
Having done a number of services contracts in my Navy days, one of the things that we learned the hard way, but then became a best practice, is from the very beginning, plan the recompete. Too often people don't think about planning the recompete until the end of the term of your first contract experience.
And you're thinking, wait, I think we talked about that.
And then you can't even imagine going to a different vendor because, oh my God, they've so integrated them into your entire processes, and then you wonder why the costs just creep up cycle after cycle. So vendors, close your ears, but government folks, please listen. Plan the recompete when you build out the first time, and you will be so thankful. And particularly, we're seeing best practices. I hope I'm not stealing some of the thunder here. That says, don't build one ESINet, build two, right? Because you're going to want to have that diverse, redundant physical capability to get your 5 nines of availability that you need to achieve through 2 4-9 contracts. If you think about the recompete, when you get to the point of developing your second ESINet that's physically diverse, that can become a component of your recompete strategy, so that you're never having to face an all or none recompete. You're regularly recompeting parts of your overall implementation. Am I on track?
You are absolutely on track. How I wish I would have known you in 2008 when I released my first RFP, because those words of wisdom would have really come in handy then. And yes, I agree. And I think that's why we go back to the need for documentation, is so we can learn from not just the experiences technically, but from our procurement and contracting experiences as well. So thanks for sharing that. Implementation, one of the things, surprisingly, we all hear about communications is key, but we heard a lot of different methodologies for communicating during an implementation process, whether it was a dashboard or an electronic blackboard, conference calls, face-to-face meetings, including the stakeholders. Communications is really vital to the overall implementation. And then when I talked about variations in the interviews, the technical issues that were identified were very different and very local based on the solutions chosen and the geography and just the nature of the different entities. So we did learn a lot of very specific things. Some of those are outlined in the report. And the other one that was so important to some people that it actually delayed implementations, but in the end they said it was worth it, is exhaustive and extensive testing. And again, all of these things are in the report in the upper areas, but the testing, whether the vendors will do so in their labs, the local entities need to have some local testing requirements as well. And so hearing about those was another commonality that we saw throughout the report.
Another best practice learned the hard way, but yes, testing and effective training is so critical that most implementations that are successful that I'm aware of take the testing environment and turn it into the training environment.
Yes.
So that you have the ability to do training without interrupting current operations. Well, let me extend that one further and suggest that as you look at your cybersecurity challenge, having that testing environment, well, part of it cleaves off as a training environment for your telecommunicators. Part of it you should consider having be a training environment for your cybersecurity defenders, because it is so hard to stay up on your game if you're a cyber defender. If you're just looking at your operational network and you're tentative in well, gosh, we don't really want to do exercising on the live network, they need a training network as well. And if that training network looks like and has the same components that your live network has, then you can with confidence introduce a red team activity in that training network such that you'll hone, sustain, and build upon the skills of your cyber defenders. So clearly that can be a cost driver, again, if you're trying to do this 6,500 times. But if you're efficiently approaching cybersecurity, take advantage of the testing environments you're going to build anyway and evolve them into a part of your sustainment of not just telecommunicator capabilities, but also your cybersecurity workforce capabilities. You'll be glad you did it that way from the beginning instead of bolting it on later.
Great nugget. Yes, absolutely. So the last area that we explored in the interviews was ongoing operations. And I think overridingly what we learned from the early adopters is that monitoring and the situational awareness that is available in Next Generation 911 with EZNet and owning or working with a network versus just CPE and somebody else taking care of your network is that monitoring component. And monitoring can be done in a lot of different ways. You can contract with your industry provider. You can do it yourself, like by purchasing software and using your in-house resources, or you can use a combination of each. But however you choose to do it, it must be thought of up front. And it's not just, oh yeah, I want monitoring. It's what level. And it was mentioned today, sometimes you get more with April and the alarms. Maybe you get more. We heard from one of our adopters, gosh, I'm getting 10,000 emails, 100 in the middle of the night, and they're things that don't even affect me. But our authority wanted to be safe versus sorry. But now we know more, and so in the next contract, we'll probably tweak which ones we receive. So we just feel like the early adopters had a common theme of the importance of monitoring and situational awareness in the interviews that took place. And on the slides, I didn't read them. There are several other things, most of them represented in the full report. but I just really want to encourage those in this room, as well as those that will read the report, that if you're planning to implement NextGen 911, it would not be a waste of your time to reach out to an early adopter. And I think that Fletch and I could both attest to the fact that everyone that was interviewed is more than willing to share their experiences. And I don't mean blow their horn and tell you how great they are. They were willing to share with us their pain and their suffering and how they got through it and how they would do it differently in the future. And I wouldn't even limit the advice to people who want to implement NextGen. I learned myself that early adopters could really benefit from talking to other early adopters as well. You know, if you're an early adopter, people don't often think of you as being complacent. But I know for myself, you do one big project, then you've been there, done that, and you're moving on to the next big project. Well, 2 years have passed, and now all these other things happened in the industry that weren't available when you implemented 2 years ago. It benefits us to circle back around, go to all the presentations that Alicia has mentioned, and talk to the early adopters to share their experience as well. I think that this whole report, and specifically the interviews with the early adopters, did show us that NG 911 is not pie in the sky. And it's not something that may be, it's something that will be. And it's something that will give us the ability to improve emergency communications across the board. And it's something that will allow us to meet the citizens' expectation. So it's not if, guys, it's when. And I applaud this group for their work in moving people forward into the adoption of Next Generation 911.
Thank you, Christy. And I'll, Tim, if you can advance it, I don't have the clicker yet until it would work its way around, or Christy can. We had 21 recommendations. I'll run through those and then wrap this up with our conclusion. But I'm not going to read through each of these. But I think as you see them, as we click through them, that you've heard a lot of discussion this afternoon about most of these. The establish a formal governance structure, I think it's critical. Developing a strategic transition plan is critical. Beginning the GIS data set development and or enhancement early. And I might comment there that that's all of these steps are not mutually exclusive. And when we saw the transition diagram, it was linear in our presentation, but it's not linear. So at various stages of that transition process to get to end state, you can be working on multiple pieces of that as you're moving forward. And GIS is one of those. So we say start it early because some of these things take a lot of time. You don't wait till your ESI net's in place to then start on your GSI. It's like I said, they're not mutually exclusive. They move forward.
Hey, David, on that note, the NISGIC, the National State GIS coordinators, or council, asked me to be one of their keynotes at their conference about 2 months ago. The same weekend, actually, as the NASNA conference, although it stayed away. And they, I spoke to them about Next Generation 911 and right about what you guys were doing and outlined how this was maturing and how important it was that the state GIS plans and coordinators are working very closely with the state 911 administrators and their sub-jurisdictions within the states. They're committed to reaching out and holding hands with the 911 community. And I put the executive directors of both organizations in touch with each other. I'm hopeful that NASNA and NISGIC will sometime next year arrange one of their conferences where they can be in the same city, if not the same venue, and facilitate some increased teaming, knowing that we're going to have so much in common with the GIS folks in this Next Gen 911 journey.
So I encourage folks to reach out to theirs, but also I encourage you to build in structural forcing functions that bring the planning entities together in the two worlds.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. Moving on in the fourth, this is what Christy just talked about, diligence in the request for proposal process at all levels. The fifth being the plan for the delivery of core services is an integral part. And I think core services is one of those things, too, in the governance model and strategic plan that has to be critical in where it's placed, who's involved in the placement, and the evolution of that. Cybersecurity, as Jay so well spoke about earlier, has to become critical for systems and operations. Identity, credential, access management, the ICAM solutions have to be considered as well, because when you're talking about multiple jurisdictions all having to push information back and forth, the ICAM is a critical part of what the structure needs to be. In short, traffic engineering studies and mapping of services as well, incorporated into system design, and all of this stuff goes back to the pieces that are in the scorecard that say you need to do these things. So. The ninth, evaluate all aspects of staffing related to. Observe existing systems. 10, engage in owners, operators of systems under consideration. Engage in comprehensive testing. You heard that earlier as well. Review standards and available services. Maintain positive relationships of the continuing entities, because it's all about relationships largely as well as the technology. And that's the governance piece that has to come along with it, and knowing your neighbors and working together with them. Remaining engaged in enforcement of system expectations, allowing for modification after implementation, because it's a dynamic process. There will be changes. Plan for that. Have a planned approach to the adoption. Identify technical staff, whether integral or internal or a third party. Prepare for operational changes in the PSAP. In 19 was convene a multidisciplinary stakeholder advisory committee at the national level. We think that there's a lot of good work being done, and one of the benefits that we had with individual agencies and or entities, and one of the concerns that we had as we started looking out was that this is a function that Lori's group is largely doing in many ways, but we think that there needs to be continued in some way, shape, or form, some way that there's an advisory committee or something that evaluates or keeps, much like what TFOPA was doing, but keeps track of what's going on and focuses a lot of those efforts in moving forward.
So I just want to make sure you just gave us homework, right? Which we'll gladly take. I want to make sure that that's not lost, because so much of this is directed at states and communities. This one, you want us to do something, right?
Whether it's
us here in D.C.,
whether it's you or whether it's some other group, it's somewhere in the system there needs to be someone who keeps track of all of this moving forward.
Yeah.
So, however that evolves.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
Right. Because that's part of getting to the national end state. If there's not something at the national level that's looking at all of that, then we're never going to get there, because it'll stay siloed, in the individual areas.
And there's some models here. We also work in emergency alerting, and it's interesting, the state emergency communications councils, the SECCs, which are the state entities that manage the emergency alerting system and how wireless emergency alerting is used within those states, has asked us to recharter a FACA, a standing FACA around, they call it the NAC, the National Alerting Committee, because we're getting to the point where they really want to have a standing element to coordinate some of these things. So we'll definitely work with our federal counterparts and make sure that we put that on our list of things to do in the next year.
And the next one kind of correlates with that somewhat, because we thought that there's been statute that has been done at the federal level and the grant funding piece, but I think the three pieces are the funding, the staffing, and the coordinating. And I think we advocate that Congress should do something to move that forward as well. because they can be part of it, advancing this whole Next Gen 911 on a national level moving forward and making it a priority instead of it just having great groups like Nina and APCO and Lori's group at Transportation and Dusty's group and without, I don't want to name, I'll lose one trying to name them all, but I think there's a lot of good work going on, but there has to be somehow that there's adequate funding for this moving forward. We're not going to get to a national forest guide without some funding and somebody taking the lead and coordinating that moving forward. So it's not going to work on just the bubble up fashion alone. There has to be some group that's helping to coordinate the movement forward in some way.
It will be in no single jurisdiction's interest to, on their own, invest in building a national forest guide.
No, that's correct.
That's got to come from the impetus of somebody with national interests in mind.
Right.
And that's a great example. I think the chairman in his last couple of visits to Congress said, look, we need a national map for 911. Well, if you look at the national map, it's really not just addresses, right? It's things like the IP address representation of where PSAPs are in relation to those maps. So that's a point well taken. I think the call to Congress is a good one, but we also need to call to our representatives in each of our states and help them understand, as they represent states and communities in D.C., how important it is.
Right. Yeah. And what we mentioned in 19, the multidisciplinary stakeholder, because 911 is, as we all know, is the first call or the first request that goes into a call for a request for service. But it's really about the first responders as well. They serve a vital piece. As Steve eloquently said, the call taker is the first piece of that chain. But from that point forward, it's about the police, the fire, the EMS, and everybody else downrange that gets that call and gets the quality of information that they can get. And if they're not in a next-gen world responding to the right location, as the routing piece goes to GIS, then we're going to have a whole series of bad situations arise, as we've already seen in some cases across the country. So I think that's all a critical part of what we're looking at in 19 and 20 combined. And then in 21, again, we talk about the cybersecurity piece and JZC3 and everything that goes with it, because you can, if you shut down the system, no matter how well the system operates, you really don't have a system. So it becomes critical to maintain it as well. So those were the 21 pieces that we came forward. So real quick conclusion, it was a goal of our supplemental report to more successfully and specifically identify those elements we talked about in the roadmap and the scorecard. It's intended to assist PSAPs, the 911 authorities. We tried to write it at the level where those who are non-technical will still appreciate the fact that it is critical information. I don't know how successful we were, reading it in some cases, but we certainly tried. But we also expressed upon them, I think, the need that they need to look for some technical expertise that can maybe even help them design it or define that as they get towards the next-gen implementation continuum. So although it can be read and used as a standalone report, we encourage everybody to go back and read the original reports from the January 29th, because it really moves on from that. The two documents together serve all of these folks moving forward, and we can move forward now in a planned transition that's very largely defined in these reports overall. So with that, I would conclude and thank you again for the opportunity. And thank he came in, but he may have left again. Michael was here. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any questions or comments from those in the room or on the bridge? Seeing none in the room, how about on the bridge? Wow. David and company, great work. A motion to adopt work group number 2's effort, please, from Fletch. Thank you, sir. Second, from Jay English. Thank you, sir. Any comments? All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and we have 3 adopted independent work group reports.
And Steve, if I may.
Yeah.
I just want to note that Gina Green, who was on the conference bridge, has indicated via email that she supports both the report and the upcoming consensus vote, as did Rob Brown, who had to depart early. I will take any other members who are on the bridge. I'll take your votes via email just so we have a record of support or non-support. And again, apologize for the issues with respect to the conference bridge. Thank you.
In talking with Timothy outside, I was not quite sure how we would wrap this up, given the fact that we had adopted the 3 independent parts. But Tim tells me it's also appropriate that now that we've adopted that, we really adopt the body of work as a whole. So can somebody please offer a motion to do that? David, thank you. Second by Dan, thank you. All in favor of adopting this as a whole?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? You better not have anybody opposed. And to Admiral Simpson I turn. You gather from the past, the Admiral has a very luxurious military career. I was fortunate to be in the military for many years too, so we have that kind of bond. He made the big mistake of joining the Navy. I made the absolute right decision of joining the Coast Guard.
Needy.
But I got to say to you, Admiral, you charged us almost 2 years ago with doing a task. I'm happy to report to you, sir, mission accomplished. Thank you.
Steve, I got to tell you, as you know, as a sister maritime service, we put a lot of stock in the maritime services, in what it takes to be a shipmate. I consider you a shipmate. I consider all of you shipmates in this task. But we also know what it means to stand the watch. Mm-hmm. And shipmate, you stood the watch. Mm-hmm. You stood the watch for decades in the PSAP arena. You stood the watch before that for decades in your service to the nation through the Coast Guard. You can rest well at night knowing that you stood the watch. We have the watch. And Steve, we'll remember you always as we engage in the duties that God's put in front of us, knowing that champions like you have gone before us, led well, led affirmatively, proactively. Shipmate, we got it.
We got it. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess the appropriate thing would be to say one more time, thank you to each of you. Thank you to your employers. Thank you to your loved ones, your spouses, your loved ones, those that supported you working when they were going to bed and you're in your little cubby in the den hammering away at this stuff because you didn't have time to do it at work. Thank you for the 2 associations that are so tantamount to what we do, to NINA and to APCO and to NASNA. We could not have done it without all of us working together. I may have quoted this before, but I'm happy to say it again. I've never worked at a McDonald's, but I've fought a few fires in McDonald's in my life. And in the back of every McDonald's, in the preparation area, there is on the wall a plaque. And it's a plaque that Ray Koch, the founder of McDonald's, first installed very many years ago in California. And on that plaque it simply says, none of us are as good as all of us. Meaning that whether you were cutting potatoes in the old days and forming hamburgers with a press, or whether you were taking an order for a latte at the counter, or anything in between, the total effort of the McDonald's team is what made it be successful. And I would offer to you that can certainly apply here for this group. And I'm privileged and I'm honored to have been a part of it. Thank you all. And safe travels, whoever might be traveling out tonight. Right? And a happy holiday, too. Okay.
Thank you all.